My husband texted me to hurry home for a special surprise after my military deployment. I walked through the front door, carrying our 1-year-old daughter, expecting balloons and a warm embrace. Instead, I found a living room packed with glaring relatives, a fraudulent DNA test slammed on our coffee table, and my mother-in-law screaming for me to get out. I had absolutely no clue that in less than 10 minutes I would be dragged out of my own home in handcuffs while a strange woman emerged from my master bedroom. My name is Riley, and I am 33 years old. Before I explain how a calculated betrayal turned my homecoming into a nightmare, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe to the channel if you have ever had to stand your ground against people who severely underestimated you. I am a cyber intelligence officer for the United States military. My job requires intense focus and long months away from the people I love. Driving home from my base that Friday afternoon, my heart was incredibly full. I had spent the last 6 months analyzing threats overseas, and all I wanted was to sit on my own couch. My 1-year-old Emma was fast asleep in her car seat. I had picked her up from daycare on my way into town, savoring the sweet weight of her in my arms. The drive through our quiet suburban neighborhood felt like a victory lap. I was finally coming back to the life I had worked so hard to build. Carter, my husband of 4 years, had been sending me affectionate texts all morning. The final message told me not to be late because his mother Barbara had prepared a welcome home surprise. I should have known better than to trust a surprise arranged by Barbara. She was a 62-year-old woman who wore her social status like a weapon, and she never hidden her disdain for my military career. Still, I pulled into the driveway with a bright smile, unbuckled a sleepy Emma, and walked up to the front door feeling nothing but pure joy. I pushed the heavy oak door open and stepped into the tiled foyer. The house was dead silent. There was no festive music playing, no smell of a home-cooked dinner, and definitely no balloons. As I shifted Emma to my hip and walked into the sunken living room, the atmosphere hit me like a physical blow. The room was packed with people. My entire extended family-in-law was sitting on the sofas and standing against the walls. Aunt Carol was clutching her purse like I might steal it. Uncle Greg refused to meet my eyes. Relatives I had not seen since our wedding day were gathered around. Nobody was smiling. Every single pair of eyes stared at me with an intense, burning judgment. The silence was heavy and suffocating. Standing right in the center of the room was Carter. He was 35 years old, a financial manager who usually maintained a perfectly polished exterior. Today his tie was loosened, his face was flushed red with manufactured rage, and his breathing was heavy. Standing directly behind him was Barbara, her arms crossed over her designer blouse, looking at me as if I were a piece of garbage. Before I could even set my duffel bag down on the floor or ask what was going on, Carter lunged forward. He slammed a piece of paper down onto the glass coffee table so hard that it echoed through the silent house. "I know everything, Riley," he yelled, his voice cracking with theatrical devastation. "She is not my child. You lied to me. You completely betrayed me." I stood absolutely frozen, clutching Emma tightly against my chest to protect her from his sudden outburst. The accusation was so absurd, so entirely disconnected from reality, that my brain initially refused to process it. I looked from Carter's flushed, angry face down to the paper on the table. It was a printed document with a bold heading that read, "Paternity Test Results." Before I could formulate a single word in response, Barbara stepped forward, her face twisted into a vicious sneer. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger directly at the front door. "Get out of my house, you cheating disgrace!" she shrieked, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. She took another aggressive step toward me, invading my personal space. "I always knew you were absolute trash. I always knew you were sneaking around on base with other men, while my son worked himself to the bone to provide for you. Pack your bags and get out right now." The entire room waited with bated breath for me to break down. They fully expected me to fall to my knees to cry or to scream in hysterics. But my military training kicked in automatically. When faced with a sudden ambush, you do not panic. You lock down your emotions and assess the threat. I did not shed a single tear. I could see a flicker of deep uncertainty cross Carter's face. He had banked heavily on my emotional devastation to fuel his public performance. Instead, he was met with the cold, calculating stare of a woman trained to dismantle complex networks of deception. I slowly lowered my heavy bag to the floor, keeping a firm grip on my daughter. I stepped closer to the coffee table and looked down at the supposed DNA test. Even from a few feet away, my cyber intelligence background allowed me to spot the glaring errors immediately. The margins on the paper were misaligned. The font of the medical laboratory logo was entirely wrong, and the barcode at the bottom looked suspiciously like a low-resolution image copied straight from the internet. I looked back up at Carter, locking my eyes with his. My voice was dangerously calm and completely steady when I finally spoke. I want to know exactly what kind of game you are playing right now, Carter, because we both know that paper is a complete fabrication. The heavy oak front door did not just open, it was thrown wide. Two uniformed local police officers stepped into the foyer, their hands resting cautiously near their utility belts. Right behind them was a woman in a sharp gray suit holding a thick manila folder, her badge clearly identifying her as an agent with Child Protective Services. The sudden invasion of law enforcement into my living room sent a shockwave through the gathered relatives. Whispers erupted among the aunts and uncles, but Barbara quickly silenced them with a sharp wave of her hand. Carter instantly transformed. The aggressive and furious man who had just slammed a fake DNA test onto the table vanished. In his place stood a trembling, terrified father. He slumped his shoulders, let his voice waver perfectly, and looked at the police officers with wide, fearful eyes. "Officers, thank God you are here," Carter said, his voice cracking with rehearsed desperation. "She just got home. I have the emergency order right here." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded legal document, handing it directly to the lead officer. The social worker stepped forward, her gaze fixed entirely on me and the child in my arms. "Riley," she said, her tone practicing that careful neutrality professionals use with volatile subjects. "I need you to remain calm. We have an emergency custody order signed by a judge just 2 hours ago. You need to hand Emma over to her father immediately." My grip on my daughter tightened purely on instinct. Emma stirred against my collarbone, letting out a soft, confused whimper at the sudden noise in the house. I looked at the legal document in the officer's hand. The seal of the local family court was stark and undeniable. On what grounds, I demanded, keeping my voice low and level to avoid frightening Emma. "A judge does not sign an emergency removal order over a disputed paternity test." "It is not about the paternity test," Carter interrupted, stepping safely behind the largest police officer. "Tell them the truth, Riley. Tell them what happened during your deployment." He turned to the child protective agent and pulled another stack of papers from his briefcase. He handed them over with trembling hands. "These are her official military medical records, obtained through my emergency spousal access. She was involved in a classified operation that went terribly wrong. She was diagnosed with severe violent psychological trauma. The military doctors recommended immediate institutionalization, but she refused treatment and manipulated her way into a discharge." I stared at him, utterly stunned by the sheer magnitude of the lie. "I am a cyber intelligence officer. My deployments consist of analyzing encrypted data streams inside highly secure server rooms. I have never seen active combat. I have never been in a firefight, and I certainly do not have a violent psychiatric history." "Those records are entirely fabricated," I stated, locking eyes with the lead police officer. "I hold a high security clearance. Any medical diagnosis of that nature would trigger an automatic suspension of my credentials. You are holding forged federal documents." "She is delusional," Barbara cried out from the corner of the room, clutching her pearls in a display of dramatic distress. "She has been having violent outbursts for months. She threatened Carter with a kitchen knife right before her deployment. We have been living in absolute terror, waiting for her to come home and snap. Please, officers, you have to protect my granddaughter." The agent flipped through the papers Carter had handed her. From where I stood, I could see the distinctive seal of the Department of Defense printed at the top of the pages. My mind raced analyzing the tactical situation. Carter had not just printed a fake document at the local library, he had forged a military general signature and a federal seal. He had submitted these forgeries to a state judge under penalty of perjury to secure an emergency custody order. This was not a simple domestic dispute. This was a highly coordinated, legally weaponized strike designed to strip me of my child before I could even unpack my bags. Carter knew that an accusation of severe mental instability backed by forged military records would force the state to act immediately to protect the minor child. He had timed the judge's signature perfectly to coincide with my arrival home from the airport. "We can sort out the validity of the documents later in front of a judge," the police officer said, stepping closer and resting his hand on his radio. "Right now, we have a lawful court order signed by a sitting magistrate. You have to hand the child to her father, or we will have to use force. Do not make us do that in front of the baby." The threat of physical force hung heavily in the air. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to fight, to tear through the room and carry my daughter to safety. But my military discipline overrode my maternal panic. If I fought the police, if I resisted arrest or caused a scene, I would be playing exactly into the violent, unstable narrative Carter had meticulously constructed for the judge. I would be giving them the very proof they needed to take Emma away permanently. I looked down at Emma. Her big blue eyes were wide, taking in the uniforms and the tense faces of the relatives surrounding us. I kissed her soft forehead, inhaling the sweet scent of her baby shampoo. I whispered that Mommy loved her more than anything in the world, and that I would be back for her very soon. With a steady, deliberate movement, I walked over to the social worker. I bypassed Carter entirely, refusing to even acknowledge his outstretched arms. I gently handed my crying daughter over to the state agent. Emma immediately began to cry, reaching her small hands out toward me. The agonizing, sharp sound completely shattered my aching heart. I forced myself to break eye contact with my crying daughter and looked straight ahead. The lead police officer unclipped the handcuffs from his belt. The metallic clink echoed terribly loudly in the sudden quiet of my living room. He stepped forward with an apologetic but firm expression, explaining that because the documents Carter had provided bore an official Department of Defense seal and explicitly detailed a risk of severe violence, the state required them to act with absolute caution. Under local statutes regarding psychiatric emergencies and the immediate safety of a minor child, he had no choice. He was placing me under a mandatory 72-hour psychiatric hold. I was to be transported directly to the county medical facility for evaluation. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice or beg for mercy. Arguing with a police officer who holds a forged federal document is a losing tactical battle. I slowly placed my hands behind my back, feeling the cold, rigid steel of the cuffs lock around my wrists. The click of the mechanism felt like a heavy iron gate slamming shut on my life. My own relatives, people who had eaten at my Thanksgiving table and smiled in my wedding photographs, gasped and whispered among themselves. They were entirely captivated by the horrific spectacle Carter had orchestrated. My mother-in-law Barbara stood tall and vindicated, her face practically glowing with a sickening mixture of triumph and malicious joy. She had finally achieved what she always wanted, the complete and utter humiliation of the woman she deemed unworthy of her son. Carter played his part to perfection. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking as if he were overcome with the tragedy of a broken family. The social worker gently patted his back, offering him quiet words of comfort. I stood there in handcuffs, a decorated cyber intelligence officer who had spent the last 6 months analyzing complex overseas security threats, being escorted out of my own home like a dangerous criminal. The sheer audacity of the setup was breathtaking. The two police officers grabbed me by the upper arms and began leading me toward the front door. The sea of judgmental relatives parted like the Red Sea, shrinking back, as if my supposed violent psychosis might be contagious. I kept my chin high, my posture rigidly straight, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing me broken. But just as I reached the entryway, the heavy mahogany door to the master bedroom clicked open. The sound was soft, But in that tense atmosphere, it drew every single eye in the room. A woman stepped out into the hallway. I had never seen her before in my life. She was young, perhaps in her late 20s, with perfectly styled blonde hair and a fresh manicure. But what made my blood turn to absolute ice was what she was wearing. She was draped in my custom silk bathrobe, the exact one I had purchased during an anniversary trip to Italy 2 years ago. She wore it loosely, casually, her bare legs stepping softly onto the hardwood floor of the home I paid the mortgage for. She did not look surprised to see a dozen people in the living room, nor did she look alarmed to see police officers handcuffing the woman of the house. Instead, she walked with a slow, deliberate confidence straight over to Carter. The social worker had just stepped away to carry Emma toward the kitchen to calm her down. The strange woman slid effortlessly into the space beside my husband. Carter did not push her away. He did not act ashamed or try to hide her from the police or his family. Instead, he reached out and pulled her in tightly by the waist, pressing her against his side. Barbara smiled approvingly at the young woman, giving her a warm, welcoming nod. The entire family watched this unfold with complete acceptance. They all knew. Every single aunt, uncle, and cousin standing in my living room had known about this woman. They had welcomed her into my home, let her sleep in my bed and wear my clothes while I was deployed serving our country. The betrayal was so absolute, so multi-layered and deeply rooted that it transcended mere infidelity. This was an organized execution of my life. "Get her out of my house," Carter commanded the officers, his voice suddenly dropping the fearful victim act and adopting a cold, authoritative edge. My daughter and my family have been through enough trauma for one day. The officers nudged me forward, guiding me out the front door and into the cool evening air. The transition from the warm, chaotic interior of my home to the quiet suburban street was jarring. The sun was just beginning to set, casting long, peaceful shadows across the manicured lawns. A few neighbors were standing on their porches, their eyes wide as they watched the neighborhood spectacle. I was marched down my own driveway, the gravel crunching beneath my boots, and pushed unceremoniously into the back of the waiting squad car. The heavy door slammed shut, trapping me in the cramped, plastic-lined back seat. The thick plexiglass partition separated me from the officers in the front. I twisted my handcuffed wrists, trying to find a comfortable position as the engine roared to life. Through the reinforced window, I watched my beautiful brick house shrink into the distance. The porch light flicked on, illuminating Carter and the strange woman standing in the doorway, their arms wrapped around each other, watching me leave. In less than 20 minutes, I had been stripped of my beloved daughter, evicted from my home, robbed of my marriage, and publicly stripped of my dignity. Carter believed he had orchestrated the perfect crime. He believed that by weaponizing my military service and forging federal documents, he had trapped me in a legal nightmare from which I could never escape. He thought I would be locked away in a psychiatric ward, broken and helpless, while he played house with his mistress and drained my assets. But as the squad car turned the corner and my house disappeared from view, the initial shock began to evaporate. The crushing weight of the betrayal did not break me, it forged me. The tears that had threatened to fall dried up completely. My breathing slowed, becoming deep and rhythmic. The panic faded, replaced by the icy, calculating precision of a cyber intelligence officer. Carter had made a fatal miscalculation. He had brought forged federal documents into a state matter, and he had targeted an operative whose entire career was built on dismantling sophisticated, deceptive networks. He thought he had ended my life, but as I sat in the back of that police cruiser, I realized he had merely handed me the exact tools I needed to destroy his. The county medical facility was a sterile labyrinth of blinding fluorescent lights and scuffed linoleum floors. The police officers handed me over to the intake staff with hushed voices, passing along Carter's forged narrative like it was gospel truth. I was processed with the careful distance reserved for the dangerously unhinged. My personal items were confiscated. My belt and shoelaces were removed. I was placed in a small, windowless psychiatric holding room containing nothing but a bolted-down steel cot and a heavy wall-mounted telephone. The heavy door clicked shut, leaving me alone in the oppressive silence. A local intake nurse peeked through the reinforced glass window, her eyes filled with a mixture of pity and fear. She cracked the door open just enough to inform me that I was allowed one phone call before the mandatory 72-hour evaluation period officially commenced. She suggested I call a family member or a divorce attorney. I thanked her politely and walked over to the metal phone. I picked up the heavy receiver. I did not dial a divorce lawyer. I did not dial a family member. A civilian attorney would take days to navigate the bureaucracy of a mandatory psychiatric hold, filing motions and arguing with local magistrates while Carter sold my house out from under me and vanished with Emma. I needed a completely different caliber of intervention. I needed the full weight of the United States military. I punched in a 14-digit sequence I knew by heart. It was not a standard 10-digit civilian number. It was a direct routing code to the Secure Operations Center at my cyber intelligence base. The line clicked, hissed with encryption static, and then connected. A sharp, disciplined voice answered on the second ring. Cyber Command Operations, identify. Major Riley Hayes. I said, my voice echoing slightly against the bare concrete walls of the holding room. Authentication code Sierra Tango 9 Delta. Connect me to Colonel Harrison immediately. Priority 1, security breach. There was a brief pause, the sound of keystrokes clattering rapidly on the other end, and then the line transferred. Colonel Harrison had been my commanding officer for 3 years. He was a man who understood the precise value of data and the catastrophic implications of a federal forgery. The connection stabilized. Hayes, Colonel Harrison said, his tone instantly shifting into operational mode. You signed out on terminal leave 6 hours ago. Why are you triggering a Priority 1 breach from an unsecure civilian line? Sir, my operational status has been compromised by a civilian hostile, I replied, keeping my words sharp and entirely devoid of emotional inflection. I am currently detained under a mandatory psychiatric hold at a county facility. The detention was executed by local law enforcement based on forged military medical documents. Forged military documents. The colonel repeated, his voice dropping an octave. Clarify the extent of the forgery, Major. The hostile presented a fabricated psychiatric evaluation claiming severe violent trauma, I explained. The document bore a counterfeit Department of Defense seal and a forged signature of a commanding officer. It was submitted to a state judge under penalty of perjury to secure an emergency custody order. They are using fake federal records to weaponize local law enforcement against an active duty intelligence officer. The silence on the line was thick with sudden calculated fury. Forging a Department of Defense seal to falsely detain a military operative was not a family court issue. It was a severe federal crime. Protocol Vanguard is authorized. Colonel Harrison stated, the military machine already revving up in his voice. I am initiating a full authentication override. What is your current location? I provided the exact address of the county medical facility and the precinct details of the officers who transported me. Understood, he replied. I am routing a digital authentication packet to the facility administrators right now. We are wiping their fake records with your actual heavily classified medical clearance. You are cleared for high-level cyber operations, Hayes. You do not have a single blemish on your psychological evaluation. I am also patching in the Judge Advocate General Office. They will contact the local magistrate who signed that order and explain exactly what kind of federal laws were just broken in his courtroom. Thank you, sir. I also need to flag a potential financial exploitation vector, I added, my mind shifting to the emptied bank accounts. The hostile has initiated massive unauthorized asset transfers. I need my primary military salary accounts locked down and isolated from civilian banking networks immediately. Consider it done, the colonel said. The JAG officers will be at your location within the hour. Do not sign anything. Do not consent to any civilian psychological evaluations. The military assumes full jurisdiction over your medical status. We are pulling you out of there, Major. I hung up the heavy metal receiver and let it drop into its cradle. The sharp clatter echoed in the small room. I sat down on the bolted steel cot and smoothed the wrinkles out of my uniform pants. Carter had spent months orchestrating his pathetic little scheme. He had printed fake logos, practiced his fake tears, and manipulated my foolish mother-in-law into playing a supporting role. He thought he was playing chess against a naive, heartbroken wife. He had no idea he had just declared war on the federal government. Outside the holding room, I could hear the faint sounds of the facility operating as usual. Nurses walking down the hall. A telephone ringing at the nurses' station. But I knew exactly what was happening in the digital space above us. At my base, technicians were currently overriding firewalls and sending encrypted data packets directly to the hospital director inbox. Military lawyers were placing extremely uncomfortable phone calls to local judges and police captains. The entire local precinct was about to receive a massive, overwhelming wake-up call. Carter's flimsy house of cards was about to be obliterated by a highly coordinated cyber strike. I leaned my head against the cold concrete wall and closed my eyes. For the first time since walking into my living room, I allowed myself to think about Emma. My beautiful daughter was currently in the hands of a man who viewed her as nothing more than a pawn, a tool to extort money and punish me. The thought made a cold fury burn in my chest. I visualized Carter and his mistress celebrating their apparent victory in my house, drinking my wine, completely unaware of the storm gathering directly over their heads. They had taken my daughter. They had stolen my money. They had tried to lock me away in a padded cell. But they had failed to understand one fundamental truth. You do not hand a sword to a trained warrior and expect them to simply bleed. You expect them to strike back. I opened my eyes, staring at the reinforced door of my holding cell. I was not a victim waiting to be rescued. I was a weapon waiting to be deployed, and the countdown had already begun. Exactly 42 minutes after I hung up that heavy metal phone, the reinforced door of my holding room swung open. The intake nurse who had looked at me with pity earlier was gone. In her place stood the hospital director, his face drained of all color, sweating profusely under the harsh fluorescent lights. Flanking him were two officers from the Judge Advocate General office, dressed in crisp military uniforms. They did not look pleased. Major Hayes, the lead JAG officer, said, stepping into the room and offering a crisp salute. "We have secured your immediate release. The local magistrate has been formally notified that the documents submitted by your husband were fraudulent federal records." I stood up from the steel cot and returned the salute. The hospital director practically tripped over himself to apologize, stammering about local protocols and state mandates. I ignored him completely. My focus was solely on the JAG officers. "What is my operational status?" I asked, walking past the director to retrieve my confiscated personal items from the front desk. "Your medical clearance is fully validated," the JAG officer replied, handing me a sealed envelope containing my verified Department of Defense psychiatric evaluation. "The local police precinct has been ordered to stand down regarding any mental health holds. However, there is a complication. The state judge cannot immediately overturn the civil temporary restraining order your husband filed regarding your primary residence. That falls under domestic family court jurisdiction. Until a formal hearing is convened, you are legally barred from coming within 500 feet of your own home." I took my phone, my wallet, and my keys from the intake clerk. Carter had anticipated this exact bureaucratic loophole. He knew forging a federal document was a massive risk, but he also knew that family courts move at a glacial pace compared to military interventions. By layering a civil restraining order on top of the fake medical hold, he guaranteed I would be locked out of my house for at least a few days. He needed that specific window of time. The question was why. I stepped out of the county medical facility into the freezing night air. The military officers offered me transport to a secure base housing unit, but I declined. I needed absolute isolation to map out the blast radius of Carter's attack. I needed to see exactly how deep this betrayal went. I walked 3 blocks down the street until I found a cheap 24-hour neon-lit diner. The bell above the door chimed loudly as I walked in. The place smelled of stale grease and strong coffee. I slid into a cracked vinyl booth in the very back corner facing the entrance. A tired waitress dropped a laminated menu on the table, but I only ordered black coffee. As soon as she walked away, I pulled out my phone. My military training dictates that when an enemy breaches your perimeter, you do not simply assess the visible damage. You immediately check the vault. Carter had not gone through the extreme, highly illegal effort of forging a military general's signature just to spend the weekend with his mistress. This was a calculated extraction. I opened my secure banking application, bypassing the standard login with my biometric authentication. I tapped into our joint savings account. The screen loaded and the numbers glaring back at me confirmed my darkest tactical theory. The balance was zero. $200,000. Gone. Every single cent I had earned over the last 4 years, hazard pay from overseas deployments, bonuses from high-level cybersecurity clearances, all of it had been completely wiped out. I pulled up the transaction history. The entire amount had been wired out exactly 48 hours ago to an offshore holding account I did not recognize. I took a slow sip of the scalding black coffee, letting the heat burn my throat. The initial shock was rapidly solidifying into a lethal, focused rage. Carter had timed the wire transfer perfectly to clear, while I was 30,000 feet in the air flying back to the States. He ensured I would have no financial ammunition to hire an aggressive defense attorney upon landing. But $200,000 was not enough to justify risking a decade in federal prison for forging Department of Defense records. Carter was greedy, and greedy operatives always leave a wider digital footprint. I logged into my encrypted network access, pulling up my comprehensive credit report through a secure military backdoor portal. My eyes scanned the lines of data, hunting for the anomaly. I found it buried under the real estate section. My heart hammered against my ribs, but my hands remained perfectly steady. Carter had taken out a massive second mortgage on our home. $400,000 had been borrowed against the equity of the house I bought with my own money. The loan had been approved and finalized just 2 weeks ago. I clicked on the loan origination details, my mind analyzing the legal mechanics of how he could possibly pull this off without my signature. The bank had accepted a power of attorney document. A document giving Carter full legal authority to make sweeping financial decisions on my behalf while I was deployed. I had never signed a power of attorney. I had specifically refused to draft one before my deployment, citing strict operational security protocols. Carter had forged that document too. He had forged my signature, tricked a notary, and used it to leverage our entire house to extract almost $500,000 in liquid cash. That was why he needed the emergency restraining order. He did not care about custody of Emma. He did not care about keeping the house for himself. He just needed me legally barred from the property so he could finalize the transfer of the stolen assets, pack up his mistress, and vanish with over $600,000 in stolen funds. Emma was nothing more than a hostage. She was a legal shield to keep me distracted and fighting a messy, highly emotional custody battle in family court while he executed a massive financial heist in the background. I sat in that dim diner staring at the glowing screen of my phone. The sheer scale of his deception was breathtaking. My husband had spent the last 6 months smiling at me through encrypted video calls, asking about my day and telling me how much he missed me, all while systematically draining my life savings and planning to frame me as a violent psychopath. He thought I would be paralyzed by the loss of my child and the sudden destruction of my marriage. He thought I would waste my time crying in a cheap motel room, waiting for a slow-moving civilian lawyer to return my calls. He fundamentally misunderstood who he had married. I finished my coffee and placed a crumpled $20 bill on the cracked table. Carter had stolen my money, but he had left my military clearance, my cyber intelligence network, and my tactical training completely intact. I walked out of the diner and into the dark city streets. It was time to stop reacting to his strikes. It was time to hunt. While I was navigating the cold concrete sidewalks of the city, breathing in exhaust fumes and calculating my next tactical maneuver, a very different scene was unfolding 10 miles away. Crystal chandeliers bathed the grand ballroom of the Oakwood Country Club in a warm golden glow. Waiters in crisp white jackets circulated with trays of expensive champagne and delicate caviar hors d'oeuvres. At the center of the lavish room stood Barbara, my mother-in-law, draped in a designer silk gown and wearing a diamond necklace that caught the light with every dramatic gesture she made. She had organized this impromptu gathering under the guise of a charity fundraiser for domestic trauma victims, but the true purpose was entirely self-serving. It was a highly orchestrated smear campaign designed to completely assassinate my character in front of the city elite. Barbara held a microphone, dabbing at her dry eyes with a lace handkerchief. She projected her voice with the practiced cadence of a seasoned actress. She spoke about the tragic sacrifices families make, spinning a horrific, entirely fabricated tale about how her beloved son Carter had barely survived his marriage to an unstable, unhinged military wife. She told her wealthy friends that the military had broken my mind, that I had returned from deployment as a violent, unpredictable monster, and that Carter had bravely stepped in at the last minute to rescue his innocent baby girl from my psychotic grasp. The crowd of socialites murmured in sympathetic horror, shaking their heads at my supposed depravity. Carter stood right beside his mother, staring at the polished oak floor, playing the role of the exhausted stoic survivor to absolute perfection. He even managed to squeeze out a single calculated tear when Barbara mentioned Emma's safety. Standing near the edge of the crowd, far away from the spotlight, were Monica and DeAndre. Monica was Carter's older sister. At 37, she had spent her entire life trying to escape Barbara's overbearing control, though she rarely succeeded in challenging her mother directly. She looked deeply uncomfortable, her hands clasped tightly together as she listened to the vicious lies being spewed over the sound system. She knew me well enough to know that the violent portrait her mother was painting completely contradicted the calm, disciplined woman she knew I was. Standing right beside Monica was her husband, DeAndre. He was 36, an African-American man with a sharp, intimidating presence that commanded respect without him ever having to raise his voice. DeAndre was a special agent with the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. His entire career was built on observing human behavior, dissecting financial discrepancies, and hunting down white-collar criminals. As he stood sipping his club soda, his highly analytical mind was working in overdrive. He did not buy a single word of his mother-in-law's tearful performance. DeAndre watched Carter closely. He noticed the distinct lack of genuine emotion in Carter's eyes. More importantly, he noticed the heavy brand-new gold Rolex gleaming on Carter's wrist. Just a month ago, Carter had been complaining to DeAndre about a severe downturn in the financial markets and tight liquid assets. The sudden display of extravagant wealth did not align with a man who had supposedly just fled a domestic nightmare with only the clothes on his back. Furthermore, DeAndre noticed Carter checking his phone incessantly, his thumbs moving with frantic, eager energy. DeAndre's federal agent instincts flared. The math simply did not add up, and in DeAndre's line of work, bad math always pointed to a hidden crime. When the speeches finally concluded and the string quartet resumed playing, the crowd dispersed toward the open bar and the buffet tables. DeAndre excused himself from Monica, needing a moment of quiet away from the suffocating hypocrisy of the ballroom. He walked down a dimly lit hallway toward the secluded outdoor terraces. As he approached the heavy glass doors leading to the east balcony, he heard a familiar voice echoing in the quiet night air. It was Carter. He was pacing back and forth in the shadows, speaking rapidly into his cell phone. DeAndre immediately stopped walking. He pressed his back against the decorative stone pillar beside the open doors, remaining completely hidden in the darkness, and listened intently. Carter was not talking like a traumatized father fearing for his life. He sounded arrogant, energized, and intensely greedy. "I am telling you, it worked perfectly." Carter laughed into the phone, his voice dripping with condescension. "She is locked out of the house and totally stranded. The judge bought the military paperwork without a single question. Just give it another 48 hours for the dust to settle." Carter paused, listening to the woman on the other end of the line. DeAndre held his breath, capturing every single word and cataloging it in his mind. "Yes, babe, I know." Carter continued, his tone shifting into something sleazy and triumphant. "The wire transfer already cleared the secondary accounts. The shell company payout will be fully accessible by Tuesday morning. Start packing your bags. As soon as I get the final custody ruling on Friday, We are liquidating the rest of the equity and moving to the new place. She will be too busy fighting the psych hold from a jail cell to even realize the money is gone. DeAndre stepped away from the pillar, his jaw set in stone. He did not need to hear another word. Embezzlement, hidden assets, shell companies, and massive wire transfers. This was no longer just a messy family dispute over child custody. Carter had just confessed to a massive financial heist, and he had stupidly used an easily traceable corporate structure to do it. DeAndre knew exactly what a shell company payout meant. He knew Carter was dumping stolen funds, and he realized with absolute certainty that Riley had been framed to facilitate a major robbery. As an IRS agent, DeAndre had the authority and the clearance to follow digital money trails that local police would not even know existed. He knew that the kind of money Carter was moving required offshore routing numbers and falsified tax declarations. DeAndre walked briskly back into the ballroom. He found Monica grabbed her hand gently and told her they were leaving immediately. He had a federal database to access, and he needed to find Riley before Carter's trap closed permanently. The flickering neon light of the roadside motel buzzed with a low, irritating hum outside my window. The room smelled of bleach and stale cigarette smoke. I sat cross-legged on the lumpy mattress, my laptop illuminating the dark space as I ran encrypted trace routes on Carter's recent digital activity. My military networks had shielded my remaining assets, but the temporary restraining order still effectively paralyzed my civilian movements. I needed a blind spot, a tactical opening Carter had not anticipated. A sharp, rhythmic knock on the thin wooden door shattered the silence. It was not the hesitant tap of a motel manager. It was the firm, authoritative strike of law enforcement. I snapped my laptop shut, slipped my tactical flashlight from my jacket pocket, and moved silently to the door. Pressing my eye to the scratched peephole, I expected to see local police returning to finish the job. Instead, I saw a familiar face illuminated by the harsh orange neon. It was DeAndre. I disengaged the chain lock and pulled the door open. He stepped inside quickly, his dark eyes scanning the dismal room before locking onto mine. He wore a heavy wool trench coat over his tailored suit, bringing the crisp night air in with him. He did not offer empty sympathies or ask how I was holding up. We both knew this was not a social call. "Your mother-in-law is currently holding court at the country club," DeAndre said, his voice a low, rumbling baritone that commanded the small room. "She is spinning a fairy tale about your psychotic break. I have spent 5 years biting my tongue at family dinners, enduring Barbara's thinly veiled racist comments, her condescending remarks about my background, and her absolute obsession with status. I stayed quiet for Monica, but watching Carter stand there tonight wearing a $40,000 watch while pretending to be a terrified victim crossed the line. This family is rotten, Riley, and I'm going to help you burn their false narrative to the ground." He reached inside his trench coat and pulled out a thick, tightly bound stack of printed documents. He tossed the file onto the worn motel bedspread. The heavy thud of the paper sounded like a gavel striking a block. "I pulled my credentials and ran a full Title 26 financial background diagnostic on your husband," DeAndre explained, pulling up a chair and leaning forward. "What you are looking at is a comprehensive trace of his asset flows over the last 8 months. Carter is not just a greedy husband initiating a messy divorce. He is a desperate man trying to cover up a catastrophic corporate embezzlement scheme." I opened the file. The pages were covered in highlight marks, transaction codes, and routing sequence numbers. My eyes darted across the data, translating the financial jargon instantly. "He has been highly leveraged in unregulated cryptocurrency markets." DeAndre continued, speaking with the rapid clinical precision of an IRS criminal investigator. He bypassed his firm's compliance protocols and diverted their primary operational capital into decentralized exchanges. He bought in on margin, the market crashed, and he faced an immediate margin call. His firm is conducting an internal audit next month. When they balance the ledgers, they will find a massive black hole. He is looking at 20 years in a federal penitentiary for wire fraud and corporate embezzlement. I flipped to the next page, analyzing a series of offshore transfers. "The $200,000 he stole from our joint account," I said, tracing the transaction line with my index finger. "He routed it to an LLC registered in the Cayman Islands." "Exactly." DeAndre nodded. "But that money was just a band-aid. It covers a fraction of what he owes the firm. He needed a massive, untraceable cash injection to replace the stolen capital before the auditors arrived. That is why he took out the fraudulent second mortgage on your house. But even the second mortgage is not enough, I stated, calculating the total deficit shown on DeAndre's spreadsheets. The combined stolen assets barely cover 60% of his total corporate debt. He still needs another $500,000 just to break even. DeAndre leaned back, his expression turning grim. He needs liquid cash, Riley. Untouchable, unmonitored liquid cash, and he needs it fast. Look at page 7. I turned to the specified page. It was a summary of a highly restricted account. My breath caught in my throat. It was Emma's trust fund. Before he passed away, my grandfather had established an irrevocable trust for my firstborn child, valued at over $600,000. The funds were locked completely inaccessible to anyone except the designated primary custodial parent in the event of an emergency. He does not care about taking the house, DeAndre said, his voice dropping into a deadly serious register. The house is just collateral damage. He forged those military psychiatric records and triggered that emergency custody order for one specific reason. He needs sole uncontested legal custody of Emma. The second a family court judge grants him full guardianship based on your supposed mental instability, he gains unilateral control over her trust fund. He will drain your daughter's future to pay off his criminal debts, and he will use the forged Department of Defense records to ensure you look too crazy for anyone to believe you when you try to report him. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with terrifying clarity. Carter's entire operation was a desperate, high-stakes gamble to save himself from federal prison by sacrificing my career, my freedom, and my daughter's entire financial future. He had used his mother's hatred of me as a smokescreen, letting Barbara parade her social prejudices to distract everyone from his impending criminal collapse. He is moving the final assets on Tuesday, DeAndre said, tapping the edge of the folder. I intercepted a communication between him and the LLC proxy. His mistress is the registered agent for the shell company. They are planning to liquidate the secondary accounts and secure the trust fund by Friday. I closed the file and looked at DeAndre. The cold, calculating fury that had been building inside me finally locked into absolute focus. Carter thought he was the smartest person in the room. He thought he could use forged federal documents to outmaneuver the system, leaving me stranded in a cheap motel while he walked away a wealthy man. I appreciate the intelligence, DeAndre. I said, my voice eerily calm. But bringing this to a civil family court judge will take too long. Carter will initiate the wire transfers the moment he senses we are onto him. I know. DeAndre smiled, a sharp, dangerous expression that mirrored my own tactical resolve. That is why we are not going to family court. We are going to let him believe his plan is working flawlessly. We are going to hand him the rope, and we are going to watch him tie the knot himself. We spent the next 3 hours turning that dismal motel room into a forward operating base. We mapped out every transaction, every forged signature, and every digital footprint Carter and his mistress had carelessly left behind. We prepared a counteroffensive that would not just stop him from taking my daughter, but would completely obliterate his entire existence. I opened a secure encrypted tunnel on my laptop, bypassing the standard commercial internet service provider of the motel. DeAndre sat beside me, sliding his federal identification card into a specialized card reader attached to his own terminal. Our screens glowed with lines of raw financial data, routing sequences, and offshore bank identifiers. As a cyber intelligence officer, my daily operations involve tracking international threat actors through highly obfuscated digital networks. Carter was a financial manager used to hiding money from civilian spouses and lazy auditors. He had no concept of the digital arsenal currently aimed directly at his financial throat. I ran a customized algorithm designed to trace rapid sequential asset transfers, stripping away the layers of privacy protection Carter had purchased from his offshore brokers. DeAndre cross-referenced my findings with the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Database, pinging the exact moments the $200,000 moved from our joint account into the ether. We worked in total synchronization, a seamless integration of military cyber warfare tactics and federal financial investigation protocols. Carter thought he had washed the money through a labyrinth of decentralized crypto exchanges, but he made a fundamental error. He had to bring the money back into a fiat currency to pay off his corporate debt. I isolated a specific routing number that kept appearing in the digital ledger. The funds had bounced from a domestic bank to the Cayman Islands through a crypto tumbler and then immediately routed back into a commercial business account located in Delaware. Carter was trying to camouflage the return of the funds by passing them through a corporate entity. I initiated a deep dive into the Delaware registry, pulling the public records and cross-matching them with hidden ownership structures. The business was registered as a consulting firm, an empty shell with zero operational history, zero listed employees, and zero physical footprint. DeAndre leaned over my shoulder, his eyes narrowing as he read the tax identification numbers associated with the corporate filing. He typed the digits into his federal database, pulling the unredacted incorporation documents. A name flashed across the screen, identifying the sole registered agent and managing director of the shell company. I recognized the name instantly from the brief glimpse I had of the woman standing in my hallway wearing my bathrobe. Her identity was now permanently linked to the stolen funds. Carter had not just given his mistress my clothes and my home. He had handed her the reins to a massive federal crime. The realization settled heavily in the small motel room. By transferring the $200,000 across international borders and utilizing internet communication networks to execute the theft, Carter had officially committed federal wire fraud. The moment the funds hit the Delaware account, registered to his mistress, the entire operation escalated from a messy family court dispute into a multi-count federal indictment. DeAndre pointed to the specific timestamps on the transfer logs, confirming that the money had moved while I was airborne over the Pacific Ocean. The premeditation was absolute and undeniable. Carter and his mistress had conspired to drain my assets, leave me destitute, and use the stolen capital to cover up his prior corporate embezzlement. They believed their convoluted routing strategy made the money untraceable, masking the theft behind layers of corporate anonymity. They underestimated the relentless precision of a federal agent and a military intelligence operative working in perfect unison. The digital footprints left behind by their greedy maneuvering were starkly visible to anyone equipped with the proper access codes. Every click, every wire transfer, every encrypted message served as a glowing beacon pointing straight toward their impending financial annihilation and complete ruin. However, a crucial tactical problem remained. Having the digital map of the stolen funds was excellent intelligence, but bringing it directly to a judge right now presented a significant risk. DeAndre explained the harsh reality of white-collar criminal prosecution. If we simply handed this data over, Carter could claim his digital identity was compromised. He could argue that a malicious third party hacked his accounts and executed the transfers without his knowledge. He might even try to blame the mistress entirely, claiming she stole his passwords and orchestrated the heist behind his back. Carter was a master manipulator, and he had already proven his willingness to lie under oath by submitting forged military medical records to secure the emergency custody order. A skilled defense attorney could tie up the digital evidence in court for years, creating enough reasonable doubt to keep Carter out of federal prison while he drained Emma's trust fund to pay his legal fees. We needed a killing blow. We needed something so definitive and legally binding that no amount of smooth talking or expensive legal representation could save him from the absolute wrath of the federal government and the unyielding hammer of the military justice system. I paced the narrow space between the bed and the window, my mind running through every possible countermeasure. We need a confession, I stated, turning to DeAndre. Not a verbal admission he can deny. We need him to formally incriminate himself in writing. We need him to legally acknowledge his control over those specific offshore assets and tie himself directly to the forged military documents. DeAndre nodded slowly, a calculated smile spreading across his face. If we get him to sign a sworn affidavit, connecting himself to the fraudulent evidence and financial structure, we bypass proving digital intent. He will hand federal prosecutors a signed confession. We just need to create a situation where greed and arrogance blind him to the trap. We need to offer him exactly what he wants on a silver platter and let him hang himself with his own pen. The plan was clear. I had to stop fighting the victim narrative he created. I had to lean into it completely. I needed to become the broken woman he expected, ensuring he felt invincible until the trap snapped shut. I turned back to the desk where my laptop hummed with encrypted data. DeAndre leaned against the peeling wallpaper, shoulders tense beneath his coat. He watched me with an analytical gaze. "The financial trail is locked down," he said, his voice a low rumble. "We know exactly where the money went and how he intends to use the offshore accounts. But there is one piece of intelligence that does not align." He pointed to the empty space on the mattress. "That paternity test." He slammed it down with absolute conviction. The formatting might have been flawed, but the narrative execution was flawless. He convinced an entire room of relatives, including local law enforcement, that you engaged in an extramarital affair. How did he actually fake a DNA test so convincingly, and why choose a paternity scandal to initiate this legal strike? I walked to my dark green duffel bag and unzipped the side compartment. I did not need a cyber trace to explain that lie. The answer was purely biological, a secret I had protected fiercely to preserve his fragile ego. I stood up and looked DeAndre dead in the eyes. Carter did not need to fake the actual scientific result of the DNA test, I explained, keeping my tone clinical and devoid of emotion. He only had to fake the official laboratory header. Emma does not share a single strand of DNA with Carter. But it is not because I cheated on him. It is because Carter has been completely sterile for the past 7 years. DeAndre froze. His professional demeanor cracked for a fraction of a second, his dark eyes widening as the magnitude of the revelation set in. "Sterile," he repeated the word, hanging heavily in the stale motel air. I nodded, pulling a sealed manila envelope from my bag. Shortly after we got married, Carter was diagnosed with an irreversible medical condition that completely eradicated his ability to father a child organically. The diagnosis devastated him. It shattered his pride and threatened the perfect image he constantly projected to his mother and high society friends. But we desperately wanted a family. We spent 2 grueling years navigating the exhausting world of fertility treatments. When nothing worked, we moved to the final medical option. Emma is the result of in vitro fertilization using an anonymous sperm donor. I slid a stack of pristine, notarized clinical documents onto the bedspread. DeAndre picked them up, his federal agent eyes scanning the dense legal jargon. Under family law, when a married couple utilizes a sperm donor, the husband must sign a binding consent form. I pointed to the bottom of the page. By signing that document, Carter legally claimed full irrevocable paternal rights to the child before she was even conceived. He is legally Emma's father. The biological DNA is irrelevant in the eyes of the court because he voluntarily and officially consented to the procedure. DeAndre stared at the medical forms, tracing Carter's notarized signature next to the clinic stamp. "This is premeditated manipulation on an entirely different level," DeAndre said with pure disgust. He used a legitimate biological fact, stripped it of all crucial medical context, and weaponized it to destroy your character. "Exactly," I replied, pacing the narrow space. He knew a standard divorce would trigger a standard division of assets. Forensic accountants would review everything instantly, exposing his massive corporate embezzlement and catastrophic crypto losses. He needed an explosive distraction. He needed a chaotic smokescreen to blind the judge and justify an emergency removal order. By claiming I am a violent, cheating military wife passing off another man's baby as his own, he painted himself as the ultimate victim. But the most sinister part of his plan was how he played his own mother, I continued. Barbara is obsessed with Bloodline's social pedigree and the flawless image of her family tree. Carter never told her about his sterility. He knew she would view it as a genetic failure. So he presented the DNA test to her as proof of my infidelity. He knew the revelation that Emma lacked the family blood would send Barbara into a vicious rage. DeAndre shook his head slowly. He turned his own mother into his strongest attack dog. By feeding her the cheating narrative, he guaranteed she would fund his expensive legal fees, mobilize her social connections, and back his emergency custody order without asking questions. She thinks she is saving her wronged son from a deceptive wife. She has no idea she is a pawn in his financial heist. He is deliberately hiding these clinical IVF records from the court, I stated, tapping the papers. He submitted the manipulated DNA test, paired it with the forged Department of Defense psychiatric evaluation to convince a judge that a dangerous woman was holding a stolen child hostage. He hid the truth to steal custody, knowing full well that holding Emma guarantees his control over her $600,000 trust fund. He plans to drain my daughter's future to pay off his corporate debts. We have his financial routing data and the airtight medical consent forms proving perjury, DeAndre said, placing the documents back into the envelope. If we present this to the magistrate right now, the custody order gets revoked. But Carter will panic. He will initiate the offshore wire transfers immediately and tie the stolen funds up in international litigation for a decade. He might try to flee the jurisdiction. Which brings us to the final phase of the operation, I replied, my voice dropping into a lethal register. We do not stop him yet. We let him walk right into the family courtroom believing he holds all the cards. We let him stand in front of a judge and swear under oath that those forged military records and manipulated DNA results are authentic. We wait until his arrogance traps him in a federal perjury snare from which he can never escape. DeAndre nodded in silent agreement, understanding the absolute necessity of patience in a high-stakes federal takedown. I turned my attention back to the encrypted laptop resting on the worn motel desk. The financial routing and the medical consent forms provided the motive and the perjury, but I needed the undeniable weapon that would bring the full crushing weight of the federal government crashing down onto his head. I pulled up the high-resolution scanned copy of the psychiatric evaluation Carter had submitted to the local police. The military judge advocate general officers had securely transferred the file to my system before they left the medical facility. I zoomed in on the top right corner of the digital document. To a civilian judge or a local police officer, the paperwork looked impeccably authentic. It featured crisp margins, official-looking barcodes, and a stark, imposing crest at the top of the page. But to a cyber intelligence officer trained to identify deepfake propaganda and state-sponsored digital forgeries, the document was a chaotic mess of rookie mistakes. I initiated a forensic diagnostic scan on the file, stripping away the visual layers to expose the underlying metadata. Look at this, I instructed DeAndre, pointing to a string of alphanumeric characters bleeding across the black terminal screen. Carter downloaded a standard template from an open-source medical database, but he failed to scrub the digital watermark. He copied a Department of Defense seal from an unclassified press release issued 3 years ago. The cryptographic hash attached to this specific seal expired 24 months before the date printed on this evaluation. DeAndre leaned over my shoulder, his eyes narrowing as he read the diagnostic output. So he effectively copy-pasted a federal seal to make his fake doctor note look intimidating. That is definitely a crime, but usually courts treat it as a secondary fraud charge during a bitter custody dispute. I shook my head, my fingers flying across the keyboard to isolate the signature block at the bottom of the page. It is not just a doctor note, I replied, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Carter wanted to ensure the local magistrate would not dare question the validity of the psychiatric hold. He wanted maximum shock value to guarantee I was handcuffed and dragged out of the house immediately. To do that, he needed authority. He did not forge the signature of a base therapist or a civilian contractor. I highlighted the looping authoritative scrawl at the bottom of the document and ran it through the military personnel database. The match flashed on the screen, instantly displaying a high-resolution photograph of a decorated military official. He forged the signature of Lieutenant General Thomas Mitchell, the commanding officer of the entire regional cyber command sector, I stated coldly. DeAndre exhaled a sharp, disbelieving breath. The room fell entirely silent, except for the low hum of the laptop fan. The magnitude of Carter's arrogance had just eclipsed his greed. In his desperate rush to secure Emma and access her trust fund, He had crossed an invisible, highly lethal line. Forging a medical document to gain an advantage in family court is a state-level felony, DeAndre said, straightening up and pacing the small room. But forging the signature of a sitting United States military general, attaching a counterfeit Department of Defense seal, and submitting that document into the public record to unlawfully detain an active-duty intelligence officer, that triggers federal jurisdiction under the Espionage and Infiltration Act. It is an aggressive attack on the operational readiness of the military, I confirmed. Carter did not just lie to a judge. He legally impersonated a high-ranking federal official to weaponize a civilian police force against a military operative. The Department of Defense does not treat that as a family dispute. They treat that as a direct threat to national security. I picked up my secure satellite phone. The local police precinct and the family court judge were completely unaware that they were currently holding a forged federal document in their active case files. If they discovered the discrepancy on their own, they might simply dismiss the custody order and let Carter walk away with a warning about filing false reports. We could not let that happen. We needed the military to step in and secure the perimeter before Carter realized he had triggered a federal alarm. I dialed the direct line to the Army Criminal Investigation Division. The connection encrypted automatically, ensuring our conversation remained completely shielded from civilian surveillance. A senior CID investigator answered immediately, recognizing my security clearance code. Investigator Reynolds, I said, keeping my voice clinical and precise. Major Riley Hayes reporting. I am transmitting a high-resolution digital copy of a forged federal document currently active in the state family court system. The hostile has counterfeited a Department of Defense seal and forged the signature of Lieutenant General Mitchell to execute a fraudulent detention order. I hit the enter key, sending the data packet through the secure tunnel. I waited exactly 15 seconds while the investigator opened the file and reviewed the digital watermarks. When he spoke again, his tone had shifted from standard protocol to absolute, unwavering authority. Major Hayes, the investigator said, we have confirmed the forgery. This constitutes a severe violation of federal law. We are preparing to dispatch a tactical unit to apprehend the civilian hostile immediately. Negative, I replied instantly. I am requesting a strategic delay on the apprehension order. The hostile is scheduled to appear in family court this coming Friday for the final custody and asset hearing. He intends to submit this forged document into the permanent judicial record under oath. If we move in now, his defense attorney will claim the document was a misunderstanding or a clerical error. If we allow him to stand before a judge and swear to its authenticity, he commits irreversible federal perjury on top of the forgery and wire fraud charges. We trap him entirely. There was a brief silence on the line as the investigator conferred with a superior officer in the background. The tactical logic was undeniable. Letting Carter dig his own grave in open court would guarantee a maximum federal sentence without any possibility of plea deals or reduced charges. Request granted. Major, the investigator finally responded. We will coordinate with the United States Marshals Service and your local contact at the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. We will hold our position until the hostile takes the stand on Friday morning. The second he submits that document, we will breach the courtroom and execute the federal arrest warrants. I terminated the connection and set the phone down on the desk. The snare was officially set. DeAndre looked at me, a fierce, satisfied gleam in his dark eyes. We had constructed a flawless, inescapable net of digital evidence, financial tracing, and federal law. Carter and his mother were currently sleeping soundly in their stolen comfort, entirely oblivious to the catastrophic reality hurtling toward them. They had pushed me to the absolute edge, relying on my maternal panic and emotional devastation to blind me to their maneuvers. They had expected me to shatter. Instead, I had methodically weaponized their arrogance, preparing a devastating counterstrike that would not just take back my daughter, but would erase their entire existence. All that remained was playing the final role to absolute perfection. I had to convince them I was truly broken. I would walk into their trap voluntarily, wearing the mask of a defeated, exhausted mother, ensuring they felt completely invincible right up until the very second the federal handcuffs locked around Carter's wrists. The waiting game had begun. Waiting in military intelligence never meant remaining idle. DeAndre and I spent 48 hours transforming the cramped motel room into a tactical command center. We taped financial flowcharts to the peeling wallpaper and pinned printouts of Carter's fraudulent records by the door. We needed absolute synchronicity between our timelines. Carter held $200,000 of stolen funds, a mere drop compared to the corporate deficit he needed to fill. The real prize he was hunting was Emma's $600,000 trust fund. To get that, he needed me entirely removed from the legal equation. DeAndre paced the short distance between the bed and the window, holding a lukewarm cup of diner coffee. He outlined the precise mechanics of white-collar criminal prosecution. If we simply handed the forged military documents to the local family court judge right now, the judge would likely just dismiss the emergency custody order. Carter would lose the immediate battle, but his expensive civilian defense attorney would instantly file motions claiming the document submission was a clerical error or a simple misunderstanding by an overworked paralegal. He might even throw his mistress under the bus, claiming she procured the documents without his knowledge. He would receive a mild reprimand for wasting the court's time, and the federal charges might fail to stick without clear, undeniable proof of criminal intent. We could not afford to let him slip through a procedural loophole. The only way to guarantee a mandatory federal prison sentence without the possibility of parole was to force Carter to take the stand and swear under oath that the documents were authentic. We needed him to legally adopt the forgery as his own creation in front of a sitting judge. To accomplish this, we had to manipulate his massive ego. Carter viewed me as a highly capable threat, which is exactly why he struck so suddenly and so viciously. But he also harbored a deep-seated arrogance. He truly believed his civilian financial maneuvers were far superior to my military discipline. If I fought him aggressively through civilian lawyers, he would become cautious and defensive. If I surrendered, however, his arrogance would completely blind him to any potential traps. The second phase of our strategy involved the illicit funds currently resting in the Delaware Shell Company account. DeAndre explained that the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division required a definitive trigger to freeze those assets. We could not simply seize the account based on the initial transfer. As Carter could argue, the movement of joint marital funds was legally permissible prior to a finalized divorce settlement. We needed Carter to attempt to move Emma's protected trust fund into that same illicit account. The moment he initiated a transfer of protected minor assets using fraudulent guardianship papers, the wire fraud became irrefutable. The federal government would then have the absolute legal authority to seize every single asset tied to his name, including the offshore accounts, the Delaware Shell Company, and his personal holdings. We needed a mechanism to accelerate his timeline and push him into taking action before the Friday morning hearing. I sat on the edge of the mattress, running different tactical scenarios through my mind. I realized we needed a face-to-face meeting. I needed to hand him the ultimate bait. I told DeAndre that I would contact Carter and request a private settlement discussion under the guise of total surrender. I would claim that the mandatory psychiatric hold had broken my spirit, that I was terrified of losing my military commission, and that I was willing to sign away my parental rights to avoid a public, messy trial. DeAndre stopped pacing and looked at me with deep concern. He warned me that walking into a room with Carter and Barbara while pretending to be shattered would be the hardest psychological operation I had ever executed. They would mock me, belittle me, and try to extract every ounce of my dignity. He reminded me that Barbara lived for these moments of absolute dominance, and Carter would be merciless. I assured DeAndre that military intelligence officers undergo intense psychological conditioning for precisely this type of hostile interrogation. I could absorb their insults without breaking character because I knew their entire world was about to collapse. I picked up my burner phone and drafted a text message to Monica, knowing she was the only conduit who could arrange a meeting without triggering Carter's suspicion. I asked her to tell Carter that I was emotionally destroyed out of money and desperate to resolve the situation quietly. I requested a meeting at a neutral location the following evening. I knew Monica would relay the message with genuine concern, which would only make my fabricated desperation seem more authentic to Carter. DeAndre watched me hit send, his expression a mixture of profound respect and quiet anger at the necessity of the charade. While we waited for Carter's inevitable triumphant response, DeAndre pulled out his federal terminal to prepare the digital snares. He drafted the necessary asset freezing orders, leaving only the execution timestamp blank. He coordinated with his field office to ensure a tactical financial team was on standby for Friday morning. The moment Carter submitted the forged documents and attempted to claim guardianship over the trust fund, DeAndre's team would execute a massive digital lockdown on every financial institution associated with Carter and his mistress. They would be left entirely destitute before the judge even brought the gavel down. The burner phone on the desk buzzed loudly. Carter had responded, agreeing to meet me at a high-end restaurant downtown. He explicitly demanded that I come alone and bring no legal representation. He was already dictating the terms of my surrender, completely unaware that he was walking into a highly coordinated federal ambush. The opulent foyer of Le Bouclier, the most exclusive French restaurant in the financial district, practically gleamed with wealth. The contrast between my carefully curated appearance and the pristine marble floors was stark and entirely intentional. I had spent a full hour ensuring I looked absolutely shattered. I wore an oversized drab olive coat that swallowed my frame, making me appear small and fragile. I had skipped makeup, allowing the dark circles under my eyes to stand out fiercely against my pale skin. My hair was tied in a messy, unwashed knot. To anyone looking, I was a defeated woman hovering on the very edge of a total collapse. The host eyed me with barely concealed disdain before guiding me toward a private dining alcove in the back of the establishment. Carter and Barbara were already seated, sipping sparkling water and radiating an aura of absolute triumph. Monica sat opposite them, her posture rigid, her hands nervously twisting the heavy cloth napkin in her lap. When I stepped into the alcove, the dynamic in the room shifted instantly. Carter leaned back in his plush leather chair, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. He wore a tailored navy suit that likely cost more than my first vehicle. Beside him, Barbara looked me up and down with an expression of pure, unadulterated revulsion. She took a theatrical sip from her crystal glass, her eyes gleaming with the deep satisfaction of a predator finally cornering wounded prey. I pulled out a heavy wooden chair and sat down slowly, keeping my shoulders slumped and my gaze fixed firmly on the polished mahogany table. I let my hands tremble slightly as I folded them in my lap. I was channeling every single interrogation survival technique I had ever learned during my military training, projecting complete submission while my mind coldly cataloged every micro-expression across the table. "You look terrible, Riley," Barbara stated, skipping any pretense of a polite greeting. "But I suppose a mandatory psychiatric hold will do that to a person. It is a tragedy, really, seeing you fall apart like this. But it just proves that my son made the right decision to protect our precious Emma from your violent instability." I kept my head bowed, forcing my voice to waver perfectly when I finally replied. "Where is she? Please, Carter. I just want to see my daughter." Carter sighed heavily, playing the role of the exhausted, magnanimous patriarch. "Emma is safe, Riley. She is currently with a highly qualified nanny at our new secure location. You have to understand that after your violent outburst and the undeniable proof of your infidelity, bringing her anywhere near you is entirely out of the question. The state agrees with me. The military clearly agrees with me. You need long-term institutional help, not a child." Monica shifted uncomfortably in her seat, opening her mouth to speak, but a sharp warning glare from Barbara immediately silenced her. I let a single calculated tear slip down my cheek. I wiped it away quickly with the frayed sleeve of my oversized coat, playing the desperate victim to absolute perfection. "I have nothing left, Carter," I whispered, making sure my voice sounded completely broken. "My bank accounts are empty. The military is reviewing my security clearance because of the psychiatric hold. I am sleeping in a cheap motel. I just want this nightmare to end. What do you want from me?" Carter exchanged a victorious look with his mother. He reached into his expensive leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents, sliding them across the smooth mahogany surface toward me. He tapped the top page with a heavy gold pen. "This is a full irrevocable relinquishment of your parental rights. Carter explained, his tone slick and authoritative. It grants me sole legal and physical custody of Emma, along with unilateral administrative control over her trust fund, her medical decisions, and her future education. It also includes a property settlement wherein you forfeit all claims to the house, acknowledging that the equity has already been heavily leveraged to pay off your marital debts. I stared blankly at the documents, pretending to be utterly overwhelmed by the legal jargon. This is everything, I said, my voice barely a breath. You are taking absolutely everything from me. I am taking what is rightfully mine, Carter corrected sharply. You brought shame to this family. You tried to pass off another man's child as my own. You became a violent threat. But because I am a reasonable man, and because my mother has a charitable heart, we are willing to offer you a way out. He pulled a cashier check from his breast pocket and placed it delicately on top of the custody papers. It was made out to me for exactly $10,000. $10,000, Carter said, leaning forward and resting his elbows on the table to intimidate me. You sign these papers right now in front of us, and you take this check. You can use it to pay for a cheap apartment, get some psychiatric therapy, and start your life over somewhere far away from here. If you refuse, I will drag you through a public family court trial. I will bring the military records proving your violent psychosis into the public domain. You will lose your commission. You will face federal charges for adultery under the Uniform Code of Military Justice, and you will walk away with absolutely zero. Barbara scoffed loudly, swirling the sparkling water in her glass. $10,000 is incredibly generous for a woman who lied about her child's paternity. You should be down on your knees thanking my son for not leaving you to rot in the streets. Take the money, Riley. Take the money and disappear before we change our minds and press charges for the severe emotional distress you have caused this family. I looked at the pathetic check sitting on top of the custody relinquishment forms. $10,000. He had stolen $200,000 from my military savings. He had illegally extracted $400,000 in equity from my home. He was planning to drain $600,000 from my daughter's trust fund to cover his federal wire fraud and cryptocurrency embezzlement. And he was offering me a $10,000 bribe to walk away and let him execute the perfect financial crime. The sheer audacity of his greed was breathtaking. I slowly reached out and touched the edge of the custody agreement, letting my hand shake just enough to sell the illusion of total defeat. I looked up at Carter, making sure my eyes reflected nothing but fear and absolute submission. I had him exactly where I needed him. He was completely blinded by his own arrogance, entirely convinced that his forged federal documents had broken me. He had no idea that he had just handed me the weapon I needed to destroy him. The crisp parchment of the custody agreement felt rough under my fingertips. I kept my hand hovering there, allowing a tremor to shake my wrist just enough to convey absolute surrender. I stared down at the $10,000 check that was supposed to buy my entire existence. The ambient noise of the upscale restaurant faded into a low hum. Waiters glided past our private alcove carrying silver trays of roasted duck and truffles, completely oblivious to the domestic execution taking place at our table. "Well?" Barbara snapped, breaking the heavy silence. Her voice sliced through the elegant atmosphere like a serrated blade. "Are we going to sit here all night? Or are you going to pick up that pen and do the only decent thing you have ever done for my son?" I kept my head bowed and remained perfectly silent. My lack of an immediate verbal response infuriated my mother-in-law. She thrived on conflict and fed on the defensive reactions of her victims. When I denied her the satisfaction of an argument, she simply escalated her attack, raising her voice loudly enough for the patrons at the adjacent tables to hear. "You always thought you were so superior," Barbara sneered, leaning forward so her diamond necklace caught the light of the chandelier. "Marching around in your boots pretending to be some important intelligence officer, playing soldier while my son stayed home and actually contributed to society. You are a joke. You spent 6 months deployed, and for what, to come back here and prove exactly how fundamentally broken you are. We always knew the military would ruin your mind, but we never imagined you would become an actual danger to a helpless infant." Carter shifted slightly in his plush leather chair, adjusting his expensive tie. He glanced nervously at the entryway of the alcove, perhaps realizing his mother was drawing unwanted public attention. "Keep your voice down, Mom," he muttered, but he made no actual move to stop her relentless verbal assault. He needed her to break me down completely so he could secure his stolen wealth. "I will not keep my voice down," Barbara retorted, her face flushing with indignant rage. She looked at me with pure, unadulterated venom. "You stole years from my son. You promised him a family, and instead you dragged him through years of expensive fertility treatments because your body is useless. And then, when you realized you were an unfit, barren failure, you went out and cheated on him like a common alley cat. You could not even give him a legitimate heir. You had to pass off a bastard child as a member of this family." The sheer magnificent irony of her insult echoed in my mind. Barbara had absolutely no idea that her precious son was biologically sterile. She had no idea that he had legally signed the donor consent forms for the in vitro fertilization. Carter had fed her a fabricated narrative about my infidelity to hide his own medical reality and cover up his financial crimes. I watched out of the corner of my eye as Carter visibly flinched at the word barren. A muscle feathered in his jaw. He knew he was playing a highly dangerous game by letting his mother rant about genetics when his own medical files sitting in my possession proved his complete sterility. Still, I did not cry. The single calculated tear I had shed earlier had served its purpose. Now I engaged a different tactical protocol. I stopped shaking. I slowly pulled my hand back from the custody documents and folded my fingers together on the polished mahogany table. I lifted my head and looked directly at Barbara. I did not glare. I did not scowl. I simply stared at her with the cold, dead eyes of a military operative assessing a neutralized threat. My absolute silence was far more unnerving than any scream could ever be. I absorbed her vicious insults without a single flinch. The military stoicism I had honed over years of high-stakes operations radiated from my posture. I sat perfectly rigid, my breathing shallow and controlled. Barbara faltered. Her tirade ground to a halt as she met my unwavering gaze. She was a bully who operated by feeding on fear and distress. Faced with a woman who felt absolutely nothing but calculated resolve, her power simply evaporated. She leaned back in her chair, suddenly looking small and uncertain. Carter noticed the shift immediately. The smug, victorious aura he had brought into the restaurant began to dissolve. He had expected me to dissolve into a puddle of weeping apologies. He had expected me to beg for access to Emma and desperately snatch up the $10,000 check to secure a cheap apartment. Instead, he found himself sitting across from a human wall. He cleared his throat nervously, tapping the heavy gold pen against the table. "Just sign the paper," Riley Carter instructed, trying to inject a commanding tone into his wavering voice. "Let us get this over with. You take the money and you walk away. It is the best deal you are going to get." I kept my eyes locked on his face, watching the tiny beads of sweat form along his hairline. He was desperate. The offshore shell company, the illicit real estate equity, the forged Department of Defense seal, it was all balancing on the edge of a razor. He needed my signature to secure his survival. I slowly leaned forward, resting my forearms on the table. The air in the alcove seemed to drop by 10 degrees. I ignored Barbara entirely and focused the full weight of my intelligence training solely on my husband. "Is this really how you want to do this, Carter?" I asked. My voice was quiet, but it carried a lethal edge that cut straight through the ambient noise of the restaurant. It was not a plea for mercy. It was a tactical warning wrapped in a simple question. I watched his pupils dilate. For a fraction of a second, the arrogant facade cracked, revealing the terrified criminal hiding underneath. He realized in that specific moment that I was not behaving like a victim of a psychiatric hold. I was behaving like an adversary who already knew the outcome of the war. "Sign it!" he demanded, his voice dropping to a harsh, breathless whisper. "Sign it right now, or I swear to God I will destroy you in federal court." The threat hung in the stifling air of the private alcove. Carter leaned so far across the table that I could smell the stale coffee and bitter adrenaline radiating from his pores. He thought mentioning federal court would be the ultimate psychological strike to finally break my composure. He expected me to flinch at the mere mention of a federal judge. Instead, I simply blinked, my expression remaining an impenetrable fortress of calm. Before I could formulate my calculated response, a sudden sharp scraping sound shattered the tension. Monica pushed her heavy wooden chair back from the table. She had been sitting frozen for the past 20 minutes, her hands gripping her linen napkin so tightly her knuckles had turned completely white. As Carter's older sister, she had spent her entire 37 years shrinking herself to fit into the margins of Barbara's grandiose expectations. She had weathered decades of emotional manipulation, conditioned to stay absolutely silent, while her brother was paraded around as the golden child of the family. But listening to Carter threaten me with federal prosecution after Barbara had just viciously attacked my fundamental worth as a woman was the absolute breaking point. "That is enough, Carter," Monica said. Her voice trembled at first, but she quickly cleared her throat, forcing a steady tone that commanded the space. "You need to stop this right now. You are acting like a monster." Carter jerked his head toward his sister, his eyes flashing with sudden, genuine shock. He was so accustomed to her passive obedience that her defiance momentarily derailed his entire train of thought. He opened his mouth to dismiss her, but Barbara struck first. "Excuse me, Monica." Barbara snapped her head, turning toward her daughter with the speed of a striking viper. "Keep your mouth shut. This is a highly sensitive legal matter regarding your brother's safety and the protection of your niece. You have absolutely no right to interfere." For once in her life, Monica did not back down. She placed her hands flat on the polished mahogany table and leaned forward, her gaze darting between her mother and her brother. "There is no legal matter here, Mom." Monica shot back, her voice rising with years of suppressed indignation. "I have known Riley for 4 years. She is the most disciplined, honorable person I have ever met. She has served this country and provided for this family while Carter has done nothing but chase status and complain about his budget. And now you are sitting here ambushing her just hours after she was released from a psychiatric ward. You are trying to bribe a mother into abandoning her 1-year-old child for $10,000. It is completely repulsive." The private alcove descended into an icy, horrifying silence. The sheer magnitude of Monica's rebellion hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot. I watched the scene unfold with quiet, tactical appreciation. Every tactical manual I had ever studied emphasized the importance of letting the enemy fracture their own command structure. Carter and Barbara were doing the heavy lifting for me, destroying their own ranks through sheer malice. I simply had to maintain my position and let their hubris run its natural course. Barbara's face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated narcissistic rage. The veneer of the concerned wealthy matriarch vanished entirely, revealing the vicious bigot hiding underneath. She slammed her perfectly manicured hand onto the table, making the crystal water glasses rattle violently. "How dare you speak to me about what is repulsive?" Barbara hissed, her voice dripping with absolute venom. "You lost the right to pass moral judgment on this family the day you decided to throw your life away. We gave you the best education money could buy. We introduced you to the finest eligible men in our social circle. And what did you do? You embarrassed us. You turned your back on your pedigree to marry some aggressive tax collector from the wrong side of the tracks." Barbara gestured wildly toward DeAndre, who was sitting quietly in the corner of the alcove nursing a club soda. He was the only African-American man in the entire fine dining establishment, but he wore his presence with the unshakable confidence of a federal agent who had faced down cartel bosses and corrupt politicians. He did not flinch at Barbara's blatant racist hostility. DeAndre knew this moment was coming, which was why he timed his intervention with such surgical precision. "You are the real disappointment of this family, Monica." Barbara continued, relentlessly driving the knife as deeply as she could. "You married a man who brings absolutely zero status or value to the table. DeAndre is nothing but a glorified accountant who harasses wealthy people for a living. You have humiliated me for the last time. If you want to side with this barren, unstable military wife, then you can pack your bags and consider yourself cut out of my life completely. Carter is my only priority now." Monica recoiled as if she had been physically struck. Tears of profound hurt welled in her eyes, but they were quickly overshadowed by a hardening resolve. She opened her mouth to argue back to defend her husband and her marriage, but a large, firm hand gently rested on her shoulder. DeAndre stood up. At 6'3", with the broad, muscular build of a man who maintained strict tactical fitness, DeAndre instantly dwarfed Carter's soft corporate posture. He did not raise his voice. He did not yell or display a single ounce of the aggressive stereotype Barbara had just attempted to project onto him. He simply straightened his tailored suit jacket and looked down at his mother-in-law with an expression of absolute Arctic contempt. "It is time to go, Monica," DeAndre said, his deep baritone rumbling with unquestionable authority. He stepped around the table, placing himself firmly between his wife and her toxic relatives. He looked at Carter, assessing the nervous sweat pooling on his brother-in-law's forehead. Then he shifted his gaze to Barbara, who suddenly looked incredibly small under his intense scrutiny. "This family is rotten to the core," DeAndre stated coldly, enunciating every single syllable with devastating precision. "Your wealth is an illusion, your status is a pathetic joke, and your arrogance is going to be your absolute destruction." He did not wait for a response. He did not give Barbara the opportunity to launch another verbal assault. He simply took Monica's hand and gently guided her away from the table. Monica did not look back. She kept her head held high, walking out of the private alcove and leaving the toxic wreckage of her childhood behind her forever. I watched them walk through the elegant restaurant until they disappeared through the front glass doors. DeAndre had played his part flawlessly, providing the ultimate distraction while simultaneously establishing his absolute disdain for their criminal enterprise. By removing Monica from the blast radius, he had officially cleared the battlefield. The air in the alcove was suffocatingly tense. Carter was breathing heavily, his eyes darting frantically toward the exit, as if he had just realized the protective walls of his family were beginning to collapse. Barbara sat rigid, fuming with indignant anger, her chest heaving as she glared at the empty space where her daughter had just been sitting. They were completely off balance, flustered, and desperate to regain a sense of control over the situation. They needed a victory to soothe their bruised egos. They needed to feel powerful again. I slowly picked up the heavy gold pen resting beside the $10,000 check, preparing to deliver the final lethal strike. I was now entirely alone with my targets, and the trap was primed to snap shut. The heavy gold pen felt ice-cold against my skin. I let my fingers tremble visibly against the polished mahogany table, holding the expensive writing instrument just an inch above the signature line of the custody relinquishment forms. I could feel Carter holding his breath. His eyes tracked the microscopic shake of my hand, his overwhelming greed completely overriding his situational awareness. Beside him, Barbara was still muttering angrily about Monica, walking out furiously, adjusting her diamond necklace to soothe her deeply bruised ego. I lowered the pen until the nib hovered a millimeter above the crisp paper. Then I stopped. I released a shaky, uneven breath and deliberately pulled my hand back. Carter slapped his palm against his thigh in sheer frustration. "What is the problem now, Riley?" he demanded, his voice tight with barely suppressed panic. "We had a deal. You take the $10,000, you sign the papers, and you disappear. Do not try to renegotiate the payout. I am not giving you a single dime more." I shook my head slowly, keeping my eyes wide and fearful. I let my shoulders slump even further forward, shrinking into the oversized collar of my drab olive coat. I pushed the cashier check back toward him, ensuring the paper slid smoothly across the wood. "I do not want your money, Carter," I whispered carefully, modulating my tone to convey absolute defeat. "I will sign the custody papers. I will give you the house, the physical guardianship, the administrative control over Emma's trust fund. I will walk away completely and never contest your authority. But I have one final condition before I put my name on this document." Barbara scoffed loudly, rolling her eyes toward the crystal chandelier. "You are in absolutely no position to make demands. Sign the papers, or we call the police right now and have you arrested for violating your restraining order. Let her speak." Mother Carter snapped, his desperate impatience leaking through his authoritative facade. He looked back at me, his jaw clenching. "What is your condition?" I reached into the deep pocket of my coat. My fingers brushed against the crisp single sheet of paper I had printed at the motel earlier that day. I pulled it out and placed it gently on the table next to his thick stack of legal demands. My commanding officer suspended my security clearance pending a formal investigation into the psychiatric hold. I lied flawlessly, my voice cracking at precisely the right moment. My military career is essentially over. If I am going to walk away from my daughter forever, I need closure. I need you to swear in writing that the military medical records you submitted to the local police are 100% authentic. If I sign my rights away today, I need to know you did not frame me. Carter stared at the single sheet of paper I had presented. It was a standard legally binding affidavit of authenticity. The text simply required the signatory to swear under penalty of perjury that the attached Department of Defense medical evaluation was obtained through legitimate spousal access channels and was a true, unaltered federal document. Barbara let out a harsh, mocking laugh. "You are completely paranoid. Of course the records are real." The state judge accepted them, did he not? Why on earth would my son sign a redundant piece of paper just to soothe your delusional mental state? "Because I will not sign away my child unless he does," I stated, locking my tear-filled eyes on Carter. "I am giving you everything you asked for. I am surrendering completely. I just need to know my mind is truly as broken as those papers claim. I need you to verify them." Carter hesitated. A flicker of genuine caution crossed his face. He was a corporate financial manager who understood the inherent danger of signing legal affidavits outside of his own lawyer's office. For a fraction of a second, the survival instinct of a white-collar criminal flared in his eyes. He knew those records were forged. He knew signing a sworn statement validating a counterfeit Department of Defense seal was incredibly dangerous. But Carter was also severely leveraged. He needed the $600,000 from Emma's trust fund to hide his corporate embezzlement before the auditors arrived next month. He needed the stolen equity from my house to clear his offshore crypto losses. And standing between him and absolute financial salvation was my signature on his relinquishment forms. "Just sign the stupid paper, Carter!" Barbara hissed, entirely oblivious to the severe federal implications of the document. Her impatience was proving to be my greatest tactical asset. She is clearly grasping at straws to protect her fragile ego. Humor her delusion so we can take the custody agreement to the judge tomorrow and be done with this total nightmare forever. Carter looked at the $10,000 check, then at the blank signature line on the custody papers. The unfathomable greed completely overwhelmed his caution. He snatched the heavy gold pen from my trembling hand. He leaned over the table, brought the pen to the affidavit, and scrawled his signature across the bottom line. He dated it perfectly. He pushed the signed affidavit back toward me, his lips curling into a smug, victorious sneer. "There," he said, his voice dripping with arrogance. "The records are completely authentic. You are exactly as violent and unstable as the military documented. Now honor our deal. Sign the custody papers." I took the pen from his hand. I did not hesitate. I did not shake. I smoothly and decisively signed my name on the relinquishment documents, granting him everything he demanded. I stood up from the heavy wooden chair. I reached down and picked up the affidavit, carefully folding it and placing it securely into the inner pocket of my coat. I left the $10,000 check sitting on the mahogany table. "I will see you in court on Friday, Carter," I said quietly. "You will not be in court on Friday," Barbara snapped triumphantly. "You signed away your right to contest the hearing. You are a ghost to this family now." I did not respond. I simply turned and walked away. I navigated the elegant dining room of Le Bouclier, moving past the murmuring, wealthy patrons. The host watched me exit, clearly relieved to see the disheveled woman leaving his pristine establishment. I pushed through the heavy glass doors and stepped out into the freezing city night. The frigid air hit my face, sharp and bracing. The instant the doors closed behind me, my entire physical demeanor transformed. The slumped shoulders vanished. The trembling ceased entirely. I pulled my shoulders back, snapping into perfect military posture. My stride became measured, authoritative, and lethal. Carter had just handed me a signed, dated confession to a federal crime. He had formally sworn under oath to the authenticity of a forged Department of Defense seal and a counterfeit general signature. He had locked himself inside a federal trap with absolutely no avenue of escape. The bait had been taken. The snare was pulled tight. It was time to execute the final strike. Friday morning dawned clear. The imposing marble columns of the family courthouse cast heavy shadows across the polished floors. I arrived 45 minutes before the scheduled hearing. I discarded the oversized coat from the restaurant wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal suit mirroring my military dress uniform. My hair was pulled into a tight regulation bun. My shoes were polished to a mirror shine. I rode the elevator to the fourth floor, my expression locked into an unreadable mask of tactical readiness. I entered courtroom 4B and took my seat at the plaintiff's table. I sat completely alone. There was no civilian defense attorney whispering frantic advice into my ear. There were no stacks of messy legal pads. I placed a single, perfectly aligned manila folder on the table in front of me. I folded my hands together and rested them on the wood, adjusting my posture until my spine was immaculately straight. I focused on slowing my heart rate to a steady beat. I was not a terrified mother begging for mercy. I was an operative waiting in a sniper hide watching the kill zone and waiting for the enemy target to walk directly into the crosshairs. The heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. Carter made his grand entrance, ensuring every eye in the room turned to watch his victory lap. He wore a bespoke suit with a crimson silk tie, completely discarding the exhausted father act he had utilized during the extraction. He walked with a swaggering cadence, his chest puffed out like a corporate conqueror. Clinging to his right arm was his mistress. She wore a designer cream dress, clutching a luxury handbag undoubtedly purchased with funds stolen from our savings. She scanned the courtroom with a smirk of profound entitlement, acting as if she had already moved into my house and assumed my entire life. Right behind them marched Barbara. She had treated this legal proceeding like a red carpet gala. She was draped in a dark velvet dress, her neck and wrists dripping with heavy diamond jewelry that sparkled obnoxiously under the fluorescent courtroom lights. She had clearly invited several of her country club associates to fill the gallery, ensuring she had a captive audience to witness her ultimate triumph. She strutted down the center aisle, leaning over the wooden pews to whisper loudly to her friends. The acoustics of the high-ceilinged room amplified her voice perfectly, ensuring I heard every single venomous word without having to strain my ears. I finally saved my precious granddaughter from that violent psychopath, Barbara announced, her voice dripping with venomous theatricality. It has been an absolute nightmare living in fear of what that unstable military woman might do. But Carter was so brave. He stepped up and took control. By this afternoon, we will have full legal custody, and that deranged woman will be locked away in a ward where she belongs. Her friends gasped and murmured their sympathetic agreements, casting fearful, disgusted glances in my direction. I did not turn around to look at them. I did not flinch, and I did not acknowledge the blatant defamation. I kept my eyes locked dead ahead on the empty judge's bench. Carter and his entourage settled into the defendant's table. He leaned back in his chair, casually draping his arm over the back of his mistress's seat. He looked across the aisle at me, taking in my solitary presence and my lack of legal counsel. A massive, victorious grin split his face. He actually believed my silence was a manifestation of total defeat. He believed that the custody relinquishment forms I had signed at the restaurant had completely neutralized my ability to fight back. He had no concept of the invisible federal crosshairs currently painting his chest. The bailiff stepped forward and announced the arrival of Judge Alvarez. The courtroom fell silent as the magistrate took his seat at the elevated bench. Judge Alvarez was a no-nonsense adjudicator known for clearing his docket with brutal efficiency. He adjusted his reading glasses and opened the thick case file resting on his desk. He looked down at the documents, his brow furrowing slightly as he reviewed the emergency psychiatric hold, the forged military records, and the newly signed custody relinquishment agreement Carter's attorney had eagerly submitted into the official record that very morning. I see we are here to finalize the emergency custody transfer and the accompanying asset distribution, Judge Alvarez stated, his voice echoing loudly through the microphone. Mr. Hayes, your legal counsel has submitted a voluntary relinquishment of parental rights signed by the plaintiff alongside a sworn affidavit from you, verifying the authenticity of the military psychiatric evaluations. Carter stood up, buttoning his bespoke suit jacket with a practiced, solemn expression. Yes, Your Honor, Carter replied, projecting absolute confidence. It is a deeply tragic situation, but my wife has recognized that her severe mental instability makes her completely unfit to care for our daughter. The military documents clearly outline her violent tendencies. She signed the relinquishment voluntarily last night to avoid further psychological trauma to our family. We are simply asking the court to finalize the transfer so I can provide a safe, stable, and wealthy home for my child. The judge nodded slowly, turning the page of the file. And you are prepared to swear under oath and upon the penalty of perjury that these Department of Defense medical records are authentic and were obtained through legitimate channels. I watched Carter closely. This was the exact threshold. This was the precise legal trigger required to lock the federal trap. If he hesitated, if his civilian lawyer intervened, the snare might loosen. But Carter was completely intoxicated by his own perceived brilliance. He did not even glance at his attorney. Absolutely, Your Honor, Carter stated clearly and loudly. I swear to their complete authenticity. The judge picked up his heavy wooden gavel. He looked over at my table, expecting me to raise an objection or burst into tears. When he saw me sitting perfectly still, my hands folded, offering absolutely no resistance, he prepared to strike the block. He prepared to grant Carter full legal custody of Emma, absolute control over her $600,000 trust fund, and total ownership of my home. Carter shot me one final, devastatingly arrogant smirk. His mistress leaned forward, practically vibrating with greedy anticipation. Barbara clutched her diamond necklace, ready to applaud. They thought the war was over. They thought they had won. Before the wooden gavel could make contact with the sounding block, the heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom burst open. The resounding crash of solid oak hitting the wall stoppers echoed like a gunshot through the silent judicial chamber. Judge Alvarez froze, his gavel suspended in midair. Every head in the gallery whipped around. Carter twisted in his chair, a scowl forming on his lips, ready to demand the bailiff remove whoever dared to interrupt his moment of absolute victory. The scowl vanished the instant he saw who was standing in the doorway. DeAndre strode through the entrance with the terrifying, unyielding presence of an apex predator executing a flawless ambush. He was no longer playing the quiet, observant son-in-law, relegated to the shadows of high society events. He was a special agent of the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division, operating on official duty. He held his gold federal badge high above his head, the metal glinting sharply under the fluorescent lights. His tailored suit jacket was swept back, revealing the holster at his hip. He walked with a heavy, measured cadence that demanded absolute submission from everyone in the room. Stepping through the doors immediately behind DeAndre were two United States federal marshals. They wore full tactical gear, dark Kevlar vests, clearly emblazoned with bold yellow lettering, and heavy-duty belts loaded with restraints. Their hands rested firmly on their tactical vests, their eyes scanning the room and immediately locking onto Carter. Flanking the marshals was a tall, incredibly stern man, wearing a dark charcoal suit and a discreet earpiece. His lapel pin identified him as a senior investigator for the United States Army Criminal Investigation Division. The sheer display of federal authority paralyzed the courtroom. The smug, victorious grin was wiped completely off Carter's face, replaced instantly by the pale, clammy sheen of pure terror. His jaw dropped slightly. He gripped the edge of the defendant table so hard his knuckles turned white. Beside him, his mistress let out a sharp gasp, her expensive luxury handbag slipping from her fingers and hitting the floor with a dull thud. She shrank back into her chair, desperately trying to put distance between herself and the man she had conspired with. Barbara, however, was entirely blinded by her own colossal arrogance. Having spent her entire life insulated by wealth and suburban privilege, she possessed absolutely no comprehension of the catastrophic federal storm that had just breached the room. She viewed the tactical interruption as nothing more than an insulting disruption to her personal social calendar. "Excuse me," Barbara shrieked, bolting upright in her pew. Her heavy diamond jewelry clattered against her chest as she pointed an accusing finger at DeAndre. "What is the meaning of this outrage? Bailiff, remove these men immediately. This is a private, sealed family court hearing. You have absolutely no right to barge in here and interrupt my son." The bailiff, a local county officer, took one look at the heavily armed federal marshals and wisely took a massive step back, lowering his hands to his sides. He knew better than to interfere with a federal raid. DeAndre did not even glance in Barbara's direction. He treated her outburst with the exact same level of attention one gives to a buzzing insect. He bypassed the spectator gallery, entirely marching straight down the center aisle, with the federal team forming an impenetrable wedge behind him. He walked right past Carter's table, ignoring the terrified financial manager completely, and approached the elevated bench where Judge Alvarez sat in stunned silence. "Your Honor," DeAndre announced, his deep baritone voice carrying a lethal, uncompromising authority that required no microphone. "I am Special Agent DeAndre Washington with the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. My team is accompanied by the United States Marshals Service and the Army Criminal Investigation Division. We are executing a federal intervention. I respectfully request that you immediately suspend all current proceedings regarding this custody and asset dispute." Judge Alvarez, recovering from the initial shock of the tactical breach, narrowed his eyes and leaned forward over his desk. "Agent Washington, this is a highly irregular disruption of a state family court matter. You better have a profoundly compelling legal justification for stopping me from finalizing this order." DeAndre reached inside his jacket and pulled out a thick, meticulously organized stack of blue-backed federal warrants. He slapped the heavy documents directly onto the wooden surface of the judge's bench. "I have authorization from the United States Attorney General and a signed warrant from the Federal District Court," DeAndre stated clearly, making sure his voice projected to every corner of the silent room. The plaintiff, Major Riley Hayes, is an active-duty military intelligence officer who has been targeted by a highly coordinated federal financial crime and a direct act of espionage. Judge Alvarez picked up the top document. His annoyance evaporated instantly as his eyes scanned the federal seals, the detailed charges of wire fraud, and the staggering financial figures. His face drained of all color. He flipped to the second page, reading the explicit outline of the forged Department of Defense medical evaluation. The judge looked down at the sworn affidavit Carter had signed just 24 hours ago at the restaurant, the very document claiming the fake records were entirely authentic. The magistrate realized with horrifying clarity that he had been seconds away from striking his gavel and finalizing an order built completely on a severe federal felony. Carter had nearly turned a sitting state judge into an unwitting accomplice in a massive cyber forgery and financial heist targeting a military operative. Judge Alvarez slowly lowered the papers. He took off his reading glasses and stared at Carter with a look of profound, unadulterated fury. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted from tense confusion to lethal execution. Carter's civilian defense attorney finally broke from his paralysis. He jumped to his feet, his hands shaking violently as he tried to insert himself between his client and the federal agents. "Your Honor," the lawyer stammered, his voice pitching high with panic. "My client has absolutely no idea what these agents are talking about. This is a simple divorce proceeding. Whatever federal confusion is happening here, we are fully prepared to cooperate and clear this up through the proper legal channels at a later date." The Army Criminal Investigation Division officer stepped forward smoothly, bypassing the panicked defense attorney as if he were entirely invisible. The CID officer stopped 2 feet away from Carter, looking down at the trembling man with eyes as cold as a frozen lake. "There is no later date, Mr. Hayes," the CID investigator declared, his voice echoing with the crushing weight of the military justice system. "And there is absolutely no confusion." I sat silently at the plaintiff's table, maintaining my perfect military posture. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I watched the meticulously constructed trap snap shut around my husband's throat, destroying his arrogant illusion of control in front of the very audience his mother had invited to witness my downfall. The federal machine had taken over the room and there was absolutely nowhere left for him to run. I rose smoothly from my chair, my movements precise and unhurried. The entire courtroom watched as I picked up the single manila folder I had brought to the plaintiff table. I walked past the federal agents and approached the bench. Judge Alvarez looked down at me, the fury still radiating from his posture. "Your Honor," I said, my voice carrying the clear, commanding tone of a military briefing. "Before the federal authorities execute their warrants, there is a foundational piece of evidence that must be entered into the state family court record. This document nullifies the entire premise of the emergency custody petition filed by my husband." I opened the folder and extracted a thick stack of medical paperwork certified with a raised seal from the premier fertility clinic in the state. I handed the documents directly to the bailiff, who passed them to the judge. "The plaintiff has submitted a paternity test claiming I engaged in an extramarital affair." I continued, turning slightly so my voice would reach the gallery where Barbara sat completely frozen. "He utilized this narrative to incite his family, justify an emergency removal order, and portray himself as the victim of a deceptive spouse. That narrative is a biological impossibility. 7 years ago, my husband was diagnosed with an irreversible medical condition, rendering him completely sterile." A collective gasp rippled through the spectators. Barbara clutched the back of the wooden pew in front of her, the heavy diamonds at her throat catching the light as her chest heaved. She stared at Carter, waiting for him to deny it, waiting for him to scream that I was lying. Carter simply sank lower into his leather chair, his face buried in his hands, completely unable to meet his mother's horrified gaze. The Golden Boy facade had just been utterly annihilated in front of her entire country club social circle. The child in question, my daughter Emma, is the result of in vitro fertilization using an anonymous donor, I stated, ensuring every syllable struck like a hammer. The documents currently in your hands, Your Honor, include the binding legal consent forms signed and notarized by Carter himself. By signing those forms, he established full, irrevocable paternal rights before Emma was even conceived. He actively participated in the medical procedure, hid his sterility from his own mother to protect his fragile ego, and then fabricated a DNA test header to frame me for infidelity. He deceived this court to gain unilateral control over a minor child solely to access her $600,000 trust fund. Judge Alvarez scrutinized the medical records, his eyes tracing Carter's signature on the clinic forms. He looked up, his jaw set so tightly the muscles twitched. "Mr. Hayes," the judge said, his voice deadly quiet, "you deliberately submitted fraudulent paternity claims to this court to bypass standard asset division protocols. You attempted to use the judicial system to steal a protected trust fund while smearing the mother of your child." Carter's defense attorney backed away from his own client, holding his hands up in a gesture of complete surrender. He wanted absolutely no part in the massive perjury snare his client had just constructed. But the state-level perjury was only the beginning. The Army Criminal Investigation Division officer stepped forward, closing the distance between himself and Carter. The heavy tactical boots thudded against the hardwood floor. Carter Hayes, the CID investigator, announced, his voice booming with uncompromising federal authority. "You are hereby under arrest. You are being charged under the Espionage and Infiltration Act for the deliberate forgery of a Department of Defense seal and the unauthorized fabrication of classified military medical records." Carter shook his head frantically, his voice breaking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. "It was just a custody dispute. I just wanted my daughter. I did not mean to threaten the military." "You forged the signature of Lieutenant General Thomas Mitchell," the CID investigator barked, stepping so close to Carter that the financial manager pressed his back against the table. "You submitted counterfeit federal intelligence documents into a public judicial record to unlawfully detain an active-duty cyber intelligence officer. You weaponized local law enforcement to compromise the operational readiness of the United States Armed Forces. The Department of Defense does not view that as a domestic dispute. We view that as a targeted assault on national security." The two United States federal marshals moved in simultaneously. They grabbed Carter by the arms, yanking him out of his plush leather chair with brutal, practiced efficiency. Carter yelped as they spun him around, slamming his chest against the defendant table. The sharp metallic ratcheting sound of heavy-duty federal handcuffs locking tightly around his wrists echoed through the high-ceilinged courtroom. Carter's mistress let out a terrified scream, scrambling backward until she hit the wooden railing separating the well from the gallery. She looked at the marshals with wild, panicked eyes, realizing the wealthy lifestyle she had been promised was evaporating into a guaranteed prison sentence. Barbara stumbled out of her pew, her perfectly styled hair falling into her face. "Carter," she shrieked, reaching her hands out toward the federal agents. "You cannot take him. He is a respected financial manager. Do you have any idea who our family is? We will sue this entire city." The CID investigator turned his cold gaze toward Barbara. "Ma'am, if you interfere with a federal apprehension, you will be placed in restraints and transported alongside him. I highly recommend you sit down and remain silent." Barbara collapsed back into the wooden bench, her hands covering her mouth in sheer terror. The wealthy matriarch, who had spent her entire morning bragging about destroying my life, was now watching her precious son being processed like a highly dangerous enemy combatant. The illusion of her untouchable social status was entirely broken, replaced by the terrifying reality of federal justice. Carter sobbed openly as the marshals hauled him toward the center aisle. He looked at me, tears streaming down his flushed face, his arrogance completely gone. "Riley, please," Carter begged, his voice cracking. "Tell them it was a mistake. Tell them I am sorry." I stood perfectly still, my hands resting at my sides. I looked at the man who had tried to lock me in a psychiatric ward, who had stolen my life savings, and who had attempted to sell our daughter's future to cover his own greed. "You made your choices, Carter," I said, my voice echoing clearly across the silent room. "Now you will face the consequences." The marshals jerked him forward, marching the sobbing, broken man down the center aisle. The wealthy socialites in the gallery shrank away from him in profound disgust, whispering furiously as the reality of his crimes set in. I turned my attention back to the front of the room. The first phase of the execution was complete. The military had secured the perimeter and neutralized the primary threat. But the financial extraction was still pending, and DeAndre was ready to deliver the final crushing blow. DeAndre stepped forward, raising his hand to halt the two United States federal marshals who were currently dragging a sobbing Carter toward the heavy oak doors. He instructed them to hold the prisoner in the center aisle. Carter, stripped of his bespoke arrogance and hyperventilating in heavy steel cuffs, stared at his brother-in-law with wide, bloodshot eyes. DeAndre did not look at him. He turned his attention entirely back to the elevated bench, producing a second, much thicker blue-backed folder from his tailored suit jacket. He placed it squarely in front of Judge Alvarez. "Your Honor." DeAndre stated, his deep voice commanding absolute silence in the cavernous courtroom. "While the Army Criminal Investigation Division has secured the defendant for espionage and forgery, the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division is simultaneously executing a federal indictment for massive wire fraud and corporate embezzlement." Judge Alvarez opened the heavy folder. The courtroom remained so profoundly quiet that the rustle of the thick parchment echoed across the room. The magistrate scanned the highlighted banking logs, the offshore routing numbers, and the encrypted transaction timestamps that DeAndre and I had meticulously decoded in that rundown motel room. "The defendant has systematically embezzled substantial operational capital from his civilian financial firm," DeAndre explained with ruthless clinical precision. To conceal this massive deficit from his corporate auditors, he initiated a highly coordinated theft of his wife's assets. Exactly 48 hours ago, while Major Hayes was airborne on a military flight, the defendant unlawfully wired $200,000 from their joint marital accounts across state lines. He utilized a cryptocurrency tumbler to launder the stolen capital before routing it into a fraudulent shell company registered in Delaware. Furthermore, he utilized a forged power of attorney to extract an additional $400,000 in illicit equity from the plaintiff's primary residence. Carter squeezed his eyes shut, his knees buckling slightly. One of the marshals gripped his bicep, hauling him roughly back to a standing position. His financial crimes were being laid bare in the permanent judicial record, stripping away any possible defense his expensive lawyers could ever attempt to mount. But his ultimate objective was the minor child's $600,000 irrevocable trust fund. DeAndre continued gesturing toward the custody relinquishment forms sitting abandoned on the defendant's table. He manufactured the fraudulent psychiatric emergency and the fabricated paternity claims to bypass the standard marital asset division. He intended to secure unilateral legal guardianship today, which would have granted him immediate administrative control over the child's protected assets. He planned to drain his own daughter's future to cover his catastrophic corporate theft. Judge Alvarez looked up from the comprehensive financial dossier. His expression shifted from judicial outrage to absolute disgust. He stared down at Carter with the cold, unyielding judgment of a magistrate who had just been weaponized by a desperate criminal. "You are hereby formally served with federal indictments for interstate wire fraud, money laundering, and grand larceny," DeAndre announced, stepping directly in front of Carter. "The Internal Revenue Service has officially frozen every single financial account, property deed, and equity holding attached to your name. You are entirely bankrupt, Carter. You do not have a single dime left to pay for a defense attorney." The mistress, who had been cowering against the wooden railing, suddenly made a desperate dash for the courtroom exit. She did not even make it 3 steps. DeAndre snapped his fingers, and 2 local bailiffs immediately blocked her path, their hands resting firmly on their duty belts. "Do not attempt to leave the perimeter," DeAndre ordered, turning his sharp gaze toward the trembling woman in the designer cream dress. "You are the sole registered agent of the Delaware shell company that received the stolen $200,000. You knowingly conspired to launder embezzled funds across international borders. The United States government considers you a primary accomplice to federal wire fraud. You are under arrest." The bailiffs grabbed her arms, securing her wrists in zip ties as she burst into hysterical, mascara-stained tears. She screamed at Carter, cursing him for dragging her into a federal indictment, completely shattering the illusion of their glamorous high society romance. With the primary targets neutralized and secured, DeAndre slowly turned his attention to the spectator gallery. He walked toward the polished wooden benches, his eyes locking onto his mother-in-law. Barbara sat rigidly in her pew, her face an ashen mask of pure horror. Her country club friends had physically recoiled from her, pressing themselves against the far walls of the courtroom to avoid any association with the spectacular criminal collapse unfolding before them. "Barbara," DeAndre said, his tone devoid of any familial warmth. He stood at the edge of the gallery, looking down at the woman who had spent the last 5 years relentlessly mocking his background and his career. "Did you genuinely believe your son could fund your extravagant lifestyle on a basic corporate salary while his firm was actively hemorrhaging capital?" Barbara swallowed hard, her heavily ringed fingers gripping her diamond necklace. "I have absolutely no idea what you are talking about, DeAndre," she stammered, her voice high and breathless. "I am a victim here. Carter lied to me. He told me Riley was violent. He told me Emma was not his biological child. I am just a concerned grandmother trying to protect my family." DeAndre pulled a single piece of paper from his jacket pocket and held it up. It was a printed bank statement. "Ignorance is not a valid legal defense against federal money laundering," DeAndre stated coldly, "especially when the financial logs show that you gladly accepted a $50,000 wire transfer directly from your son's illicit Delaware shell company just 3 days ago." Barbara gasped loudly, her hand flying to her mouth. "That was a gift," she cried out defensively, looking frantically at her wealthy friends for support. "Carter told me it was an early birthday present. He said he had closed a highly lucrative real estate deal. I had absolutely no idea the money was stolen. I am completely innocent. You used stolen funds to pay for your country club membership renewals, your luxury vehicle leases, and your recent cosmetic procedures," DeAndre countered with ruthless factual accuracy. "You accepted $50,000 from a fraudulent corporate entity that was actively washing money stolen from a deployed military officer. The Internal Revenue Service does not care about your birthday presents, Barbara. We care about asset forfeiture." The wealthy matriarch began to hyperventilate, her chest heaving as the catastrophic reality of her situation finally breached her arrogance. She looked at DeAndre with wide, terrified eyes, realizing the man she had constantly belittled was now holding the absolute power over her entire existence. Because you received and utilized illicit capital tied to a federal embezzlement investigation. DeAndre announced, his voice ringing with absolute finality. I have officially signed a federal seizure warrant. The Internal Revenue Service is currently freezing all of your personal checking accounts, your investment portfolios, and your retirement funds. We are placing a federal lien on your primary residence pending a comprehensive money laundering investigation. Effective immediately, you have zero access to your wealth. Barbara stared at him, her mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. The devastating realization that she had lost her mansion, her social status, and her entire fortune in a matter of seconds completely overloaded her system. Her eyes rolled back into her head. Her knees buckled instantly, and she collapsed into the wooden pew, fainting dead away in the middle of the gallery. Her country club associates shrieked and scattered, refusing to even catch her as she fell. DeAndre looked down at her unconscious form with absolute unfiltered disdain. He turned back to the federal agents, giving them a single sharp nod. The execution was completely finished. The financial annihilation was absolute. 6 months passed since the heavy oak doors of the family courthouse slammed shut, trapping Carter inside his own perfectly constructed snare. The federal justice system moves with a terrifying mechanical efficiency when dealing with corporate embezzlement and espionage charges. Carter did not secure a high-priced defense attorney to save him from his spectacular downfall. His assets remained permanently frozen, leaving him at the absolute mercy of an overworked public defender who took one look at the mountain of undeniable digital evidence and advised an immediate guilty plea. Carter is currently serving a mandatory 10-year sentence in a maximum security federal penitentiary. The presiding judge denied him any possibility of parole, citing his egregious weaponization of state and federal institutions to execute his financial crimes. Carter now spends his days confined to a bleak, windowless concrete cell. He has been entirely stripped of his bespoke suits, his expensive gold watches, and his arrogant delusions of grandeur. He is surrounded by hardened inmates who do not care about his former corporate status or his inflated ego. He has plenty of time to sit in the deafening silence of his cell and realize that his massive hubris was the sole architect of his complete destruction. The man who tried to manipulate the federal government now answers to roll calls and lockdown procedures, entirely powerless and completely irrelevant. The mistress, absolutely terrified of the impending wire fraud conspiracy charges, attempted a desperate escape. She blatantly violated her strict bail conditions and booked a one-way ticket to South America, hoping to disappear into obscurity and avoid the severe consequences of her greed. Heavily armed federal marshals apprehended her at the departure gate in Miami before she could even reach the jet bridge. She is currently awaiting her own federal indictment without bail, her luxurious stolen lifestyle permanently exchanged for a scratchy orange jumpsuit and a cold stainless steel toilet. But perhaps the most poetic justice of all was entirely reserved for Barbara. The Internal Revenue Service did not accept willful ignorance as an excuse for laundering $50,000 of stolen equity. DeAndre's financial task force seized her sprawling suburban mansion, swiftly auctioning the property off to cover the massive federal tax liens and criminal penalties Carter had accrued. Barbara was unceremoniously evicted from her own personal kingdom with only a single suitcase of belongings. She now resides in a tiny, cramped, government-subsidized apartment on the industrial outskirts of the city. The walls are paper-thin, and the noisy streets outside are a constant, agonizing reminder of her spectacular fall from grace. Her elite country club associates immediately ostracized her, blocking her phone numbers and flatly refusing to acknowledge her existence if they happened to cross paths on the street. The wealthy matriarch who had built her entire identity on social supremacy and the brutal degradation of others now sits completely alone in a threadbare armchair, entirely forgotten by the high society she sacrificed her family to impress. As for me, the storm that Carter unleashed did not destroy my foundation. It simply cleared the toxic debris, leaving behind a pristine path forward. Today, the bright afternoon sun streams through the wide, polished windows of the military base banquet hall, casting a warm, triumphant glow over the entire room. I stand near the center of the hall, wearing my pristine dress uniform. The crisp, dark fabric is immaculately pressed, and the newly awarded silver insignia on my shoulders gleams brightly under the lights. I have just been officially promoted to the rank of major. My cyber intelligence unit claps loudly, their genuine respect echoing powerfully in the large space. I am holding my beautiful daughter Emma securely in my arms. She is wearing a tiny navy dress, clapping her small hands together and giggling at the sudden burst of celebratory noise. She reaches out to touch the shiny metals pinned to my chest, completely safe, entirely secure, and utterly loved. Standing directly to my right are DeAndre and Monica. Monica looks healthier, lighter, and more genuinely happy than I have ever seen her. She has officially cut all ties with her mother, refusing to answer the desperate manipulative letters Barbara occasionally sends from her subsidized apartment. Monica finally stepped out of her toxic shadow and claimed her own peace, building a beautiful life based on honesty and mutual respect. DeAndre stands tall beside her, holding a crystal glass of sparkling cider. He is a proud, steadfast guardian who chose righteousness over toxic family loyalty when it mattered most. DeAndre raises his glass high, catching the attention of our small, tightly knit circle. He offers a heartfelt toast to our collective resilience, to surviving the destructive fires set by those who were supposed to protect us, and to the unbreakable bonds forged in the absolute heat of battle. We clink our glasses together, the sound clear and ringing with absolute victory against the quiet murmur of the banquet hall. I look at Monica and DeAndre, the incredibly brave people who stepped out of the shadows and risked their own peace to pull me from the wreckage. They prove that true loyalty is earned through actions not demanded by genetics. I look at my wonderful daughter, whose future is completely secure and full of bright possibilities. Family isn't blood, I say, my voice perfectly steady and echoing with the unyielding truth of my journey. It's the people who stand by you at the bottom of the abyss and hand you a sword to climb back up. Have you ever had to fight a war against the people who were supposed to be your family? Tell me your story in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe for more stories of surviving the impossible. Until next time, stay strong.